आवाज करो, गाओ खुशी के गीत, उसका गुणगान करो, इबादत करो उसकी, इबादत करो, इबादत करो उसकी, इबादत करो।
Thank you, dear brothers and sisters, for invoking the Lord. It's my delight in welcoming you all to this insightful and enlightening session on philosophies of resistance and freedom, exploring Buddhist and Bhakti poetry by Professor Gayatri, Assistant Professor at Symbiosis School of Liberal Arts, which will be philosophically fruitful and an enriching session. Welcome you all to this session. And now to formally inaugurate this enlightening session, I now call upon Father Doni Raja to deliver the welcome speech.
Good morning, all of you. Actually, first I was given a pleasant task of introducing Gayatri Mendonha and welcome her for this inaugural lecture, this annual memorial lecture. Then now I am also given an additional task of welcoming you all. Okay. So first, let me welcome Ms. Gayatri Mendonha. As you know from the AMC's introductory speeches or talks, she is an assistant professor at the Symbiosis School of Liberal Arts. She holds master's degrees in both philosophy and English. I am happy because she is also an alumna of Jnanadeepa. I'll come a little later how that happened. She has been teaching courses in literature, religion, and philosophy since July 2014. She has also taught at Flame University, and she was a guest lecturer in Jnanadeepa, and she was also a guest lecturer at DePaul University, Chicago. She has been conducting research and presented papers and published in the areas of literature studies, philosophy, and religion. That's kind of an official profile of Gayatri Mendonha. But last year I had a chance, Gayatri happened to stay with us in Papal Seminary for a few days. At that time we had few table conversation over shared meals. So it's kind of a personal profile. personal encounter with Gayatri Mendonda. She shared how she happened to land in JD and then do her philosophical studies at Jnanatheepa. After her academic studies, the secular academic studies, master studies, she wanted to take 2 years break. Her parents thought, what an insane idea to take a career break. Okay, now you have started learning and then you should go ahead with your academic career. Why would you take a break? Then she said, no, I am taking a break. So she took a break. It is during those 2 years she wanted to pursue her philosophical studies in Jnanatheepa. And I am sure at that time, anytime, our professors usually dissuade secular students to pursue their philosophical studies in Jnanatheepa. Why? Document-wise, a certificate in Jnanatheepa, a degree certificate in Jnanatheepa may not add a greater value to a secular academic career or life. So I'm sure they must have tried to dissuade her not to continue, because usually these studies are meant for people in religious formation or priestly formation. But still, she chose to pursue her studies. From her sharings over those conversations, I inferred that she had a great time at JD. She enjoyed the friendship of all the religious sisters who studied with her and also with candidates in priestly formation. So she chose that decision against her parents and of course against the dissuasion of the professors at that time at JD. So therefore it is not a coincidence, in my opinion. She has been invited to give a lecture on philosophies of resistance and freedom. So therefore it's fitting that you give us a lecture on these philosophies of resistance and freedom. So dear Gayatri Mendonda, welcome to Jnanatheepa. May I invite all the students to give a round of applause to welcome Gayatri Mendonda. So thank you so much for accepting and being here to give us this annual memorial lecture. Now, to all of you, welcome to this annual memorial lecture, Smet Annual Memorial Lecture 2024-25. It just reminds us that we are walking in the footsteps of great stalwarts who had a great vision for this church in India, and it is under their shadows that all of us are walking in these campuses. Therefore, participate in this annual memorial lecture as actively as possible and raise your questions and listen to the lecture, and may this time that we spend together be fruitful to all of us. May also take this occasion to welcome all the faculty members for this annual memorial lecture. Welcome to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Father, for welcoming the chief guests, dignitaries, and the gathering. Your addressing has truly set the tone for the day. Thank you, dear Father. And we now welcome our dear Professor Gayatri onto the dais, as I welcome Father Stephen and Sister Sarita to honor them with a book and a shawl. We welcome you, dear ma'am. Thank you, dear Father and Sister, for honoring. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter, says John Keats, a great poet of the Romantic era. So, to let us hear those unheard melodies and the legacies of Professor Richard Smet and Professor John the Marneffe, I now call upon Father Henry. We welcome you, Father.
Okay. See, there is a saying in medieval Kannada poetry. I'm not going to give you Kannada medieval poetry, but I'll give you the gist of it. Uh, where is mango tree and where is koel, kokile? What is the connection? And where is the gooseberry from the mountain and salt from the ocean? What is the connection? And what is the connection between Guheshwara Linga, that is the highest reality in Lingayatism, and the connection of Guheshwara Linga with the devotee, Sharana? So why I am bringing this relation is, where is Father Desmet, Father de Marneffe, Henry and Gayatri? And what is the connection? Connection is there. Connection is, these two luminaries were my teachers. And I had the same privilege to have Gayatri as my student also. So that is the connection. Okay? So we are celebrating the memory of these great two figures, Father de Marneffe and Richard Desmet. So my task here is to introduce them briefly and highlight their legacy. Also, they lived in DNC community where I am also living. So both these Jesuits hailed from the country of Belgium, belonging to the same South Belgian province before coming to India, and they belonged to Calcutta Jesuit province. But they made India as their adopted home. Desmet was born in 1916, and after his arrival in India served JDV from 1954 till his death in 1997. Whereas de Marneffe was born in 1918, joined JDV in 1955 and died in Pune in 1998. So quite contemporaries. Their scholarly output comes from two different traditions, Eastern and Western, but both complemented well. I was a student of Desmet for a particular course called Shankara Exegesis, especially studying the text. Okay, these days studying the text may be a rarity. Both had their erudition in their respective fields, but they did not remain only in JDV. Their erudition also reached outside JD, especially in Pune University. And also they contributed so much with their literary output. They contributed to the Marathi Encyclopedia of Philosophy, so many articles. It's very interesting to see at an early stage in 70s how Marathi language brought out Encyclopedia of Philosophy in 3 volumes, and those volumes are there in our library. Okay. I'm just reminding. Yeah. So they had both had many things in common, but each one had their unique identity, and they were complementary. For instance, Desmet was an internationally recognized Indologist. His doctoral thesis was on method of Shankaracharya, famous thesis, and good many of his works are already published. It opened a new era in the scholarship regarding Advaita Vedanta of Shankaracharya. He was a prolific writer with more than 8 books and over 350 scholarly articles. On the other hand, de Marneffe was an outstanding classroom teacher whom students respected for his clarity of thought and depth of knowledge and loved for his humane, fair, and gentlemanly personality. Desmet was a solitary, rigorous researcher who enjoyed being lost in his intellectual island, churning out scholarly papers, whereas de Marneffe was a genial team player who teamed up with erudite colleagues particularly in the long planning and publishing of massive Marathi encyclopedia of philosophy, to which he contributed 40 articles. And the leadership quality is also quite well known. Smet gave leadership mostly to scholars outside the confines of JDB. If you remember, he was the first president of the Association of Christian Philosophers of India, ACPI. On the other hand, Marneffe gave a magnificent account of his leadership talents, mostly in JDB campus, having held all the major offices of JDB. That time it was JDB, now we call it JD. Including the presidentship for 3 years. He was the chief architect of the new philosophy program of JD in the mid-1970s, particularly the credit system. With regard to their concern and sensitivity to the poor and the underprivileged too, their approaches were different, but focus is the same. Marneffe had a delicate, soft corner for JDB's non-teaching staff, especially laypersons, to which a lasting testimony was the housing program he started for the workers. Smet, in his own quiet, non-conspicuous manner, lent a helping hand to many needy persons whenever and wherever it was possible. Dear friends, we are honoring these two great luminaries. And it is a fitting tribute, I would say, that we have annual seminar like this on various topics. So we have taken an apt topic this time by Professor Gayatri Mendana. And she has a lot of interest in interfacing philosophy, literature, and religion. I think it's a very good idea, especially what she's talking on. At the licentiate level, we have a course called Buddhist Classics, and there is one particular book of Buddhist literature known as Therigata, originally in Pali, but translation in English is available. So I wish Gayatri all the best. May these two luminaries inspire us all. Thank you.
Thank you, dear Father, for shedding the light on the greatness and legacies of the profound contributors and great scholars. In honoring these great figures, I now call upon the chief guest of the day and the representatives of the three classes and the representative from the licentiate students, our dean, to light the lamp. Thank you, dear friends. With great enthusiasm and honor, I now welcome our esteemed speaker, Professor Gayatri, who will deliver the lecture on today's theme and to shine the rays that comes from her deep and refreshing perspectives on Buddhist and Bhakti poetry. Let's put our cool and warming hands together to welcome her warmly.
All right, so good morning. Am I audible behind as well? Yeah, great, okay. So thank you so much for that very warm welcome, fathers, brothers, sisters, because JDV has meant a lot to me. I have studied here, I have made friends here. It has been sort of the two best, happiest years of my life, just sort of studying philosophy, learning, engaging in conversations, and especially, I mean, today is a very important day, and it's a great honor for me to be able to deliver this, this particular lecture in honor of such great luminaries. So I will begin. All right, so in terms of why I chose this particular topic, is it something that resonates very deeply with me in terms of what we see happening in India and the world today, right? So with increasing armed conflict, polarization, we find that we live in an increasingly divided world. And sometimes we need to go to the past. Sometimes we need to go to these kind of, whether it's Buddhist philosophy, whether it's mystic poetry, to try and make sense of our present, right? How do we deal with contemporary challenges? How do we navigate the world that we find ourselves in? And where do we find the answers, the wisdom, the path? So it becomes very important to talk about and have these conversations. And it's very much about action as well. We don't need to be armchair philosophers sort of sitting and having these lovely conversations in the safety of our classroom spaces, right? Finally, you're all going to go out into the world, you're going to be interacting with all kinds of people. And how do you navigate, how do you sort of navigate those spaces? And the greatest skill for our students as well, they're dealing with changing job markets. You have an increasingly sort of technological world with progress at a very rapid pace, right? So finally, what the primary skill I would want you all and our students to sort of have is to have a resilient mind, right? To be able to have a flexible mind, to be able to understand the nature of the mind and reality. And why Buddhism? Because Buddhism has a 2,500-year history of just studying the nature of the mind, right? Freud and all come much later, right? Look at a over 2,500 years history of studying the mind. Now, when you talk about questions of reality, one way of doing it is you look at the external world, you put something under a microscope, you study it. The other way of studying the internal landscape of your mind is to make these very deep interior journeys, right? To spend time in contemplation, in reflection, in meditation, and the insights that you gain out of that help you to navigate the challenges of our world. So, right, and I'll also, apart from Buddhism, I'll talk a little bit about Kabir. So again, a 15th century mystic poet from Varanasi, and Lal Ded, again, 14th century Kashmir, right? So different centuries, different contexts. But are they all saying the same thing? Are they in some way all drinking water from the same well, right? Because if you've made that deep journey to the interior and you've been able to understand the nature of your own mind and reality, in some way there is a collapse of the subject-object duality, right? So it doesn't matter whether you're a Buddha or a Kabir or a Lal Ded or someone in your contemporary world, right? If you're able to make that journey and you're able to understand the nature of your own mind and collapse that subject-object duality, then you're drinking from the same well. It doesn't matter which tradition you come from, right? So, and of course, they are iconoclast poet mystics. And the wonderful thing about these poet mystics is what they're singing, and they're oral mystic poets, right? They're illiterate, mystic poets, but their poems come from their lived experience. Which is why you have Kahat Kabir or I Lalla, right? This is a testimony. That poem is a testimony of that journey to the interior that I have made, right? It's a testimony of my experience, of what I have seen. I have crossed, Lalde talks about crossing the field of emptiness. She talks about the void mingling with the void. What does she mean? Right? And these are what you call even the Therigata that Father Henry was talking about, right? These are inspired verses. This comes from the Therigata, of course, is the lived experiences of the very first Buddhist nuns, right? And that is, the Therigata is probably the first anthology of women's poetry in the world, right? And they talk about their struggles on their path to enlightenment. They talk about deep suffering, right? We have the Theragata as well, of course, which is poems by the first Buddhist monks, right? But to understand that these are poems that come from their lived experience, right? So and in a way, it helps us to gain insight into what that experience of enlightenment is like, right? Finally, each of us have to experience it ourselves. All of these poems that I will discuss, everything that I'll be talking about today, is only the finger pointing to the moon, right? It's not the moon itself. That is something that only you can experience in the spaces of your own mind, right? You can't gain this experience secondhand. You have to wrestle with the darkness within. You have to understand, you have to sort of make sense of your own, and the mind can be a very tricky place, right? Some of you who've done Vipassana meditation or silent meditation, what happens when you encounter your own mind, right? And yeah, so these are folk songs. These are practices of enlightenment. And the wonderful thing about Kabir and Lalde, because they're folk songs, because it's oral poetry, it's no longer in the sacred language of Sanskrit, right? It's in the living. Kabir calls it the living language in terms of the bhasha, right? It's flowing. It's alive. It's understood by anyone who can speak it, right? It's available to all in that sense, right? So, and they're folk songs sung in the street. So that's why it says Kabir, Sanskrit is like well water, and bhasha is like the living water of the brook, right? So, and it's available. It doesn't matter what your caste is, what your creed is, what your religion, what your sex is, right? If you're able to understand the language, you have access to this experience of enlightenment. So, transcending the limitations of all frameworks. And the thing is, we like to put people in labels and boxes, right? So, is Kabir Hindu or is Kabir Muslim? Is Lalde Hindu or is Lalde Muslim? They belong to both traditions. You can't put them, they don't belong to any particular sect or religion, right? So, I mean, and which is why Lalde has different names. So you can call her Lalla, you can call her Lalde, you can call her Lalla Arifa, you can call her Laleshwari, right? Because you can't put these people in boxes. So they belong to the common spiritual traditions for both Hindu and Muslim communities, transcending borders, religions, regions, right? You should listen to, I mean, Kabir is being sung in Pakistan, which is just absolutely beautiful, right? So as living oral traditions, their fluidity ensures that they cannot be caught and held, right? You can't box these kinds of mystics, right? And mystics in any tradition. So Kabir has contempt for the sacred Brahminical language Sanskrit. Through his poems and dohas, he attacks orthodoxy in his search for truth. His poetry has a vivid streak of social criticism, making trenchant observation on caste prejudice, religious sectarianism, hypocrisy of any kind, arrogance, violence. Both Lalde and Kabir spoke against oppressive structures and critically interrogated practices of inequality and injustice that were prevalent during their time, right? Let's not assume that, it's only in certain times that we have polarization, divisions, injustice, right? So, and the minute, both of them were iconoclasts, right? Both of them were labeled mad and heretical, right? So, Lalde says, I have worn thin my fingers and thumb telling my rosary beads. but I have not been able to dispel duality from my mind. What's the use of saying the of praying, of saying the rosary, if you still haven't been able to dispel duality, right? So I'll talk about duality later and why she's saying this, right? But this is, in the sense that finally, if we haven't changed in the way we interact with people in the world, if we're going to be closed-minded and cut off and sectarian in that sense, then what is the use of all the rituals and the prayers, right? She says, the idol is but stone, the temple is but stone. From top to bottom, all is but stone. Whom will you worship, O stubborn Pandit? Kabir says, calling out Maula, Maula, Maula still escapes us. So just by calling out God's name doesn't mean you understand or you know what God is, right? So, and he says, it's just as well my prayer beats scattered. I'm free from all that holy chatter. The burden on my head is gone, right? So, and I'm not saying, and this is for each of you all to think about and reflect upon, right? I'm not saying that rituals are something that one shouldn't do, but why are we doing it? And if you're doing it and it doesn't bring about change in the way you see the world, and the way you see yourself, and the way you engage with other people, then what's the point? So Kabir says, when Ram plays inside you, that's wisdom, right? And his understanding of Ram is not the Ram of the Ramayana, so that's a separate conversation. But parrots can repeat a mantra, mynas can recite the Veda. Without a guru, you'll stay confused. The Brahmin is clay, the Vaishya clay, the whole creation is clay. In this clay, everyone mingles, right? Is what Kabir has to tell us. So who's bringing in the separation? Who's bringing in the duality, right? Buddha too avoided the nitpicking pedantry of many philosophers contemporary with him and opted for a more broad brush colloquial style, right? He wants to speak to people in a language that they can understand, right? So whether it's Buddha, whether it's Kabir, Lalde, they rejected the cult of Brahminical deity worship, distinction of caste, doctrines, practices, animal sacrifice, fasting, visiting sacred places, reading sacred books. They held that the mere practice of religious rituals and scholarships do not lead to self-knowledge, right? Just by parroting it, just by repeating it, just by bathing in the Ganges, right? Your sins are not washed away. So salvation is not ready-made. So, and we as Christians also have, so because I'm not talking about Christianity today, but it's something that we can also reflect on. So, and what I find very interesting is while Kabir and Lalde are making transient sort of observations on social issues, their poetry is profoundly inward-looking and with an evocation for profound inner transformation, right? So on one hand, it's not that their heads are in the clouds and they're just talking about something that is disconnected from your social world and your social reality. The two are interconnected, the two are intrinsically linked, right? So change in your spirituality will bring about social transformation, right? You can't separate the two. As enlightened poems, they offer probing insights into the nature of the intricate mind-sprung veil of delusion. So this word delusion that we keep coming back and talking about, what is delusion? We are all deluded. What delusions do we have? How are we seeing things as they really are? Right? How have we constructed our reality? You'll all have understand hermeneutics as well, right? How do we make meaning of the world? And does it match with how things really are? So much of our suffering, so much of our discord, so much of our misunderstandings are because we're not seeing things as they really are. We haven't understood the nature of mind and reality, right? So their poetry examines, and I'll give you all examples of that, the nature of the mind and the body, points out to the tangle of delusions that we live in and urge us to wake up. It's as if all of us have been sleeping, right? And in that kind of delusion, we cause deep suffering to ourselves and others, right? So constantly Kabir is asking you to wake up. There are poems where Kabir is just crying, right? Bodhisattva is something that we look at in terms of in a Buddhist connotation, but so was Kabir, so was Jesus in that sense, right? Where you care about the suffering of the other, right? It brings you to tears and you do something about it. Yeah, so, and there's a sense where we've all been sleeping. Our houses are on fire and we're still sleeping. So Kabir is all the time sort of urging you to wake up. Linda Hess, who's a scholar of Kabir, says that Kabir turns the habits of the mind and the structures of the self upside down. It's almost a cognitive shock, right? Because Buddhism has this idea of anatta, which is no self. In Buddhism, there is no God, there is no soul, there is no self. And what do we mean by no self? So we'll come to that, right? But how and sometimes, which is why sometimes we should introduce these ideas also sometimes a little gently, because when you encounter these ideas of that you are deluded, and when Kabir points out the ways in which you are deluded, and so does Buddha, sometimes it's almost as if you've been living your life in a particular way, and you've woken up, right? It's like you're wearing these dark glasses, and you remove them when you come into your room, and or in sunlight, and there's a shift that happens, right? So Kabir is harsh. His poems are not dedicated to God. His poems are dedicated to you, right? It's to the seeker, and he's asking you to wake up. So Hess invites us again to draw inspiration from the 8th century Buddhist poet Shantideva, who believed that devotion to individual spiritual liberation and devotion to relieving suffering in the socio-political world are united at the root, right? You can't separate the two. As a seeker, as someone who's spiritual, right? When it comes to injustice, when it comes to what we see happening in our world today, right? Both your spiritual transformation and the social political world are linked. Thus, in the imagination of Kabir, a city devoid of caste and religious identities, of ego fissures and divisive categories, he describes it as that Ajab Shahar, right? That wondrous city. And that can be glimpsed in your own mind, right? Finally, for change to happen in society, it has to first happen in your own mind, right? Author Glenn Slater writes, if cosmic matter has given rise to consciousness, and we are now called to grasp the nature of consciousness, realizing that thinking about our thinking is a necessary companion of any exploration and understanding of the universe that surrounds us, our grasp of the inner world becomes just as vital as our grasp on the outer world, perhaps even more so. Because everything that you do in your outer world, you act in the world depending on how you've shaped your inner world, right? And that's something that I'll come to the whole story of the I. Who am I? And whatever story you have given, whatever identity you have constructed, is that a story? Is that fictive? Is that fiction, right? But it becomes a story that is so compelling, right? And we act in the world believing that particular story to be true. So Buddhism attacks that, Kabir attacks that, and I will discuss that. Buddhist traditions all point to the complete cessation of suffering as their pragmatic goal. They're very clear. What is the goal of Buddhism? You look at the Four Noble Truths, right? The cessation of suffering. Nobody else you look at Western psychology, it's a comparatively very recent discipline in that sense, right? And they're not promising you the cessation of suffering. What does this mean? Is it something that you think we can even achieve? The complete cessation of your suffering, not the cessation of your pain. You will grow old, you will die, you will experience ill health, right? But you will not suffer. Yeah, and that's what Buddhism is offering you. This is their central practical concern that drives their investigation to the nature of mind and reality, right? This is their goal. The clarity of Buddhism's philosophical insights as emancipatory, rational, critical discourse invites ways of understanding the nature of the mind and reality to bring about the transformation in the way we engage in our world, right? At the heart of divisive agendas and polarization is the construction of the self in opposition to the other. And we're seeing increased polarization across the world, right? And armed conflict. So why is that happening? We need to understand the root of the problem. Yeah? So, and at the heart of it, right, is you construct the self in opposition to the other. Maria Haim, another Buddhist scholar, writes that one's hatred and anger are attached to a fixed, holistic, and often caricatured conception of the other, right? And this is a separate conversation, but sometimes I feel that there is breakdown of dialogue. We've forgotten how to talk to each other, right? We have a caricatured conception of the other. We think we've understood them, and we don't understand them as nuanced and complex human beings, right? We put a particular label on them, and we think we've understood them, right? And we don't bother to dialogue, to engage in conversation, to understand, right? You think of someone like even a Hannah Arendt trying to understand Eichmann, right? Hannah Arendt, who was a German Jew, trying to understand Eichmann, who's a Nazi officer, right? And she says trying to understand is not the same as forgiveness. But can we understand? Can we because otherwise there are no solutions, right? If we can't even try and engage in understanding different perspectives, right? So, yeah. In a world being torn apart by violence to settle political conflicts, and in the face of divisive ideologies, growing polarization, the construction of nationalistic identities, and these are threatening to engulf the whole world, right, in armed conflict. We must seek out the root of the problem. And are there other ways of acting? In the face, yeah. And we're seeing this, right? We're seeing what's happening in certain parts of the world. So we are reminded not to hate and despair, and it's very easy to despair, right? Because after a point you become numb. You don't know what to do with so much suffering, right? Or you start hating. But what I would suggest is we're trying to understand the root of the problem, and we're trying to come up with solutions. So Buddhist monk and scholar Matthew Ricard reminds us, the point is neither to condemn those who are driven by hatred, because that's so easy to do, right? But that's not the point. Nor to tolerate such destructive emotions as if they were an intrinsic part of existence. Instead, they are treated as symptoms of a disease that can be cured if we make the necessary effort, right? You have to understand why it's happening, understand why people are doing the things that they do. So Buddhism's approach is extremely pragmatic. Okay, so think of, right from Kabir and Buddha, what they're trying to do is forget trying to judge somebody else. Can we turn the lens within? Can we look at our own prejudices, our own blind spots, right? Can we be harsh and critical? Can we, so that's, and can we challenge our own assumptions? We think that we are right and they are wrong, right? We think we understand everything. We think that our values are right and theirs are wrong, right? And yeah, so we act out of the assumption that our thoughts are and we act out of the assumption that our thoughts are accurately representing reality, right? We think that the way we see reality is perhaps the only way to see reality, right? But is that true? Are you ready to question your own beliefs, your own values, your own understandings? To take up the Buddhist path is to recognize that one's mind is deluded. In that, there's a fundamental misperception in the way we are seeing things. The primary delusion, so we don't have time to talk about all the delusions, but the primary delusion is an intense clinging to self with respect to outer and inner phenomena. The Buddhist path, committed to the cessation of suffering and liberation for all beings, offers us a way out of these psychological and emotional nets towards greater moral agency and freedom. So Kabir and Laldev lament, right? There's a certain sense of crying for the mind that fabricates its own deep suffering. We don't need someone to come from outside and torture us. We do such a good job of it ourselves, right? So we are causing our own suffering. We are going in circles, right? We think of how much, and we're living in a world with increasing mental health issues. Yeah, so think of the suffering that your own mind has caused you. And where has that suffering come from? Why do we suffer? And it's not compulsory to suffer, right? There are ways to get out of suffering. Right. So we fabricate our deep suffering through deluded and dualistic perception of reality. Says Kabir, you are caught in a snare upside down, right? we are caught, we are trapped in all of these nets, and very often it's the nets of our own making. So your own mind has created the nets into which your mind falls, right? And it's only your mind that can unravel those nets and go to a place of freedom and greater agency in that sense, right? And what is samsara? Samsara again is wandering from lifetime to lifetime, this circling, right, in this kind of deluded world. So says Laldev, I gently lament for you. Mind, you are in love with illusion, right? And sometimes we don't want to question our delusions and our illusions, right? So the 8th century Buddhist scholar, poet, monk Shantideva held that the root cause for all the aggression and violence in the world and all the fear that there is, right? What is it that you fear? All of your fear, all of your aggression, all of your violence, and fear of enemies, of evil forces, of poisonous snakes, and so on, comes from self-clinging, from our attachment to a non-existent I. Yeah? So, which is why Buddhism takes you to a place where there is fearlessness, there is freedom, there is luminosity, there is bliss, right? But first you have to do the very tough job of what Kabir says, you have to cut off your head, right? What does he mean? He says, cut off your head. To enter the house of love, cut off your head, keep it outside, and then step inside. Yeah? So cutting off your head is a fabrication of your ego identity. Are you ready to do that? And our narrow conceptions of a permanent self. Only those who are ready to surrender everything and lay down their ego identity have the right to enter the house of love. Says Kabir, this is the house of love. It's not your favorite aunt's house. Cut off your head, put it on the floor, only then you may enter. Kabir stands in the marketplace, flaming torch in hand. And what is his demand for anyone who would follow him? He says, first burn your house down, then come along with me. Are we ready to do that? Kabir tells us, if I burn the house, it is saved. If I preserve it, it is lost. Yeah, so the more you hold on. So let's go straight at it, right? The story of the I, which is the root delusion. The story of the self, why is it such a powerful story? Why is it so difficult for us to let go of it? It holds a powerful grip over your imagination. And striking at the very heart of an identity. Your identity is something you've spent a lifetime fabricating and constructing. You don't want to question it. You don't want the carpet to be swept off from underneath your feet. You don't want to confront the abyss, right? The world, and it's not just an identity that we have been constructing, the entire world we have constructed in our heads, right? The world itself is open. However, in the act of assigning labels and values to the things of our world, we as eternal subjects superimpose meaning and enclose the external world. So the world is something that is open. We enclose it with meanings, right? We put that's a table, that's a chair, right? Where does it come from? Where do our labels come from? Where do our ideas of who we are and who someone else is come from, right? And think of this imposition of meaning that we do on a daily basis, right? And we do it to make our lives meaningful. And it's something that our conceptual mind does. And in that way, we close the world. We enclose it, right? And yet we live in an ever-shifting, impermanent world. And impermanence, again, is something that we're going to have to discuss, right? And we've been through the COVID-19 pandemic, right? Kabir talks about death. Kabir talks about impermanence. Buddha, Laldev, right? So in an ever-shifting, impermanent world, perceptually and perpetually beyond our reach, we seek security in the act of fixing meanings that we ascribe to our reality. Because we're terrified, we need a handle, right? We need handles to be able to make sense of people and our world. Yeah, so we fix meanings. But are those meanings fixed? Are those final? Are those the only way of perceiving the world? The conceptual closures in language act as representations of our world and constitute our reality and shape our experience. And we believe that is our reality, and we engage with it as the only reality. So this constructing of an identity, so we are given a name, right? We are so attached to our names, and we are taught to call ourselves I. What does it mean when you say I? Where does the I exist? Because everything is in flux, your ideas, your body, your thoughts, your feelings. Where is the I located? What do you mean? We use the word I on a daily basis, right? Where is it located? We enter into the discursive realm of language and believe that the I is a real and solid thing, an independent thing in a universe of other things, right? All of which that we have labeled. We look at the I as an unchanging entity that persists through time. What is the I? It's not unchanging for sure. Around this autonomous self-construct, right? Something that we have fabricated, and it's not something that we've done by ourselves, right? We've done it with and for others, right? It's part of our socialization. So we weave an identity through linguistic, social, and psychological conceptual elaborations. We spend a lifetime fabricating and nurturing the self. Right? And you look at the world that we live in, our modern institutions, society, it rewards individualism, right? And self-serving attitudes. So all the more it becomes very, very difficult for us to let go of this self-construct. Buddhist monk and scholar, again, so Matthew Ricard says, this imaginary line in the sand that we draw between the interior and the exterior, the consciousness and matter, self and other, gives rise to the ego. We are cut off, right? When you talk about the self, it's just here. So when you define the self, what do you mean? Is it here? Is it just include you? Does it include everyone in this room? Does it include your nation, your country, the world, the universe? What do you understand by the self, right? And how you define that will influence the way you engage in the world. Right? So given that this distinction is fictional, we constantly find ourselves at loggerheads with reality, right? And then we have various crises, right? Further, this fictive I is constructed, and the primary problem that I have is the I that you have constructed is constructed as an act of separation from the other, right? And it's a most challenging delusion to rend. It is a powerful web of delusion that offers the illusion of comforting security. The dualistic mind fabricates the mind-sprung categories of self and other, and which is why Kabir says, stone by stone, people build a palace and say, my house, not your house, right? How have we cut up and separated the world? And it's very difficult to give up this self-constructing that we indulge in, right? Because we have been fabricating it for so long, we're almost addicted. So, So J. Garfield, another Buddhist scholar, says that we narrate and construct each other. So it's not that I'm just constructing myself, I'm constructing you as well. We narrate and construct each other in the hermeneutical ensemble act of social life, right? So we're all doing it all the time. As hermeneutical beings, this mode of identity weaving and conceptual constructions of the things of our world come naturally to us, right? So it's just, we don't even question it. We take it for granted that the self exists, that the I exists. So it's described as ontological addiction, right? The unwillingness to relinquish an erroneous and deeply rooted belief in an inherently existing self or I, right? And that sometimes results in this impaired functionality, right? That arises from such a belief. And look at the dangers of it. We weave identities, right? So Garfield also says that this weaving is not, the self is not metaphysical but literary, right? And that's something to think about. However, we take our constructions, and the minute we think of the self as something that is real and solid, that's why we encounter suffering. That's why we are swept up in this tumultuous sea of emotions and feelings and anger and fear and hatred. And you've constructed your identity in such a way that any threat to that identity could result in anger, could result in violence. So to what extent are you willing to go to protect that identity? right? Yeah. In clinging to this deeply ingrained delusion of ego identity, when the dualistic mind fabricates a fearful, this is where we need to worry, right? A fearful construction of the other, it will breed fear, suspicion, anger, violence, and suffering, right? And very often these delusions, whether it's modern society or various other ideologies that support it, exist within a system that enables the possessors of these identities to believe them to be inherently existing final truths, right? Something that you're willing to die for, something that you're willing to kill for. When citizens accept the fabrications handed to them without critical engagement, right? And this has happened in the past, right? In various countries, it can generate deep paranoia, right? You don't trust each other, you don't trust your fellow citizen. And you can see what's happening in the armed conflict that we see happening around the world. When citizens, when we weave sectarian identities that construct the other as subhuman, evil, dangerous, right? See this constructing that we do. One is we construct the self, and when we construct the other, and we say that we construct someone else as evil, as dangerous, and we know what happened in Nazi Germany, where you, through language, you use certain things to describe a certain group of people that then allows people to treat them a certain way, right? All because of the language that you use, the word choices to describe a particular group of people, right? So, and then when you describe someone as evil and dangerous, they are deserving to be destroyed, right? And it makes it possible for us to commit acts of socially sanctioned violence, yeah, when the other is described in those terms. Thus, yeah, okay, so thus caught in conventional dualisms, right? And to quote Buddhism again, deluded beings slash each other with swords and stab each other with spears, right? So see the danger that comes from these identity constructing that we do, right? What do we do and how do we construct the other? Kabir bears witness to this because he was living in extremely polarized times. Kabir bears witness to this saying, I've seen the world is mad. The Hindu says Ram is the fountain of love. The Turk says Rahman. Then they kill each other. No one understands. The act of killing another, when we kill another, it makes a mockery of our understanding of love. Can we even speak of love then? Maria Haim reminds us that the three poisons, right? In Buddhism, the three poisons are greed, hatred, and delusion, right? They drive one's life and decisions. And when your decisions and your way of, what happens when people who are driven by greed, hatred, and delusion are acting in the world? When they're, yeah. When it's driving your life and your decisions, they constrict our freedom to seek other pursuits or to find happiness in things that we have. So it causes deep suffering to yourself as well. Not only are you wreaking havoc and destruction and violence upon the world, but you are in deep suffering yourself. The more we are clouded by our afflictive emotions, and think of any time when you are angry, right? And you're acting in the world, what happens? What do you say? What do you do? Right? Your perception is distorted. And problematic patterns of thinking. And you are less free, because in the title of this talk, we're also talking about freedom. You are not free at that point, right? And you're not free to act intelligently and well. So Maria Haim writes that when blinded by unwholesome mental states, we are held captive to them, tethered to a painful past and fantasies of vengeance, right? This is Maria Haim, a Buddhist scholar, right? When you're in that kind of, think of the word that she uses, this, we are held captive to them, these unwholesome tendencies and mental states, tethered to a painful past and fantasies of vengeance. When our worldview is colored by toxic mental afflictions that misrepresent the objects of perception to us, we act in the world through fear and hate and very limited mental freedom, right? And this causes, like I said, dukkha is the loose translation is suffering. It's more existential in nature, but Buddhism talks a lot about dukkha, right? So you realize how much dukkha something like this can cause. So Kabir, and which is why Kabir in his time wants you to wake up, right? And he's harsh. He uses ridicule, he uses satire, he shows that you're foolish. He points out your own foolish, deluded behavior. He demands that we turn the lens on ourselves, right? And this is what he says. And you need to be aware of the intricate traps of your own mind. Says Kabir, I set out in search of evil. Right? He's going out in search of evil, and he says, not an evil one did I find. When at last I looked into myself, who more evil than I? Yeah? It's very easy for us to, again, construct other people in different ways. Yeah? But when we turn the lens, what is it that we find? What are our blind spots? What are our prejudices? What are our biases? Right? What are we missing? How have we been constructing ourselves, the world, and other people? The Dhammapada says, we are what we think. All that we are arises from our thoughts. With our thoughts, we make up the world. Yeah? And how much time do we spend then in reflection, in contemplation, in meditation, understanding the nature of your mind, understanding the nature of your thoughts, because that's constructing your reality. That's constructing your world. That's constructing how you act in it, right? So the Samyutta Nikaya again, the mind is that in the world by which one is perceiver of the world and conceiver of the world, right? So you're perceiver and conceiver of your world, and it's all done through your mind. So so the importance of understanding your mind, right? More than anything else. So Harari, again, just to quote briefly, if we are willing to make great efforts in order to understand foreign cultures, unknown species, distant planets, it might be worth working just as hard to understand our own minds. And we had better understand our minds for us before the algorithms, before the algorithms make up our minds, right? And we know that we don't know, you are beginning, I don't know how many of you all are reading what AI is capable of doing, right? So you're going to be living in a world with increasing challenges, right? A world we don't fully understand. We don't even know what AI is fully capable of doing, right? And so much, are you going to leave your decision making then to algorithms, right? Because you haven't bothered to look into your own mind, right? And what happens then when the algorithms make the decisions? Yeah. So I'll just end with this. As mind possessors, human beings have attempted to probe the nature of the immaterial mind. What is the mind? It's so fascinating, right? That whole idea that we are not just matter, but we are also consciousness. And what does that mean? What is your consciousness? What is your mind? And think of so many, whether even within the Christian tradition, and especially Christian mystics, right? Sought truth through solitary journeys into the interior of their own minds, right? And through deep meditation, they arrived at wisdom. Yeah, and I'll talk more about that in the second half, where what kind of wisdom have they arrived at, and how can we use that to deal with real world problems and solutions. Yeah. Thank you.
We act in the world, how we act in our world. And thank you, ma'am, for such an insightful lecture, and which is more engaging. And we now open the floor for questions and insightful interactions. Please feel free to raise your questions, and let's receive the stream of wisdom from our resource person. So I call upon Reverend Father Derin Vaz to moderate the session.
Good morning to all of you. Thank you, ma'am, for your lecture. I was very keenly listening to you. And if I sum up all your lecture in one or two sentences, it's like you are trying to say to come out of the boundaries, to transcend the boundaries, stop doing and constructing identities for the others. It's a kind of like you come out of some kind of ontological addiction. And I was thinking about the philosophers of like Henry Bergson, who speaks about the realities of flux and the realities something moving. And I was thinking about the Heraclitus and Parmenides, who was said about being is the reality, or the reality is one thing. So all these kinds of thoughts were going on. So it was very profound and insightful to listen to you, especially about the poets Kabir, Laleshwari. So thank you for this insightful lecture. Now the floor is open to you, open for all of you. You may please raise your questions to the point. Keep it as brief as possible, so that everyone gets enough time to pose the questions. You may please raise your hand, and the mic will be passed on to you. We'll have till 10:30. We'll have the question answer session, and the floor is open to you.
Thank you, madam, for beautifully bringing out the resistance and freedom motives in bhakti and Buddhism. I was surprised though, why would you put them together? Because these are entirely different kinds of resistance. As I listened to you, I thought Buddhism did not have any bhakti literature like Sufism or Hinduism. Maybe Buddhism failed to be inspired by bhakti. Again, the growth of bhakti and the gradual decline of Buddhism coincide. Maybe Buddhism failed to adopt, or rather, it missed out something. Maybe even bhakti is responsible for the eventual disappearance of Buddhism. What are your thoughts?
All right. So, yeah, y'all can hear me? Yeah. So the reason I've put, and it's a good observation that they're two completely different traditions, and why would I put them together, right? And to also sometimes when we understand bhakti, we think of it as primarily in the context of sort of bhakti towards God, right? But the way when I look at Kabir's poetry, when I look at Lal Ded's poetry, they're not talking as much about God in that sense, but they're talking about this very, so I would in fact call them more as mystics on the Jnana Marg more than the Bhakti Marg, right? Because they are trying to make this very deep journey to the interior, to understand the nature of their minds, to be able to collapse that subject-object duality, and non-duality is something that both Kabir is talking about, Lal Ded is talking about, other Bhakti poets also talk about non-duality, right? That collapse of subject-object duality. And it's something that is very, very central to Buddhism. So, and my understanding is that if, whether it's a Buddha or a Kabir, if they have made this particular journey to the interior and try to understand the nature of their mind and been able to collapse that subject-object duality, then for me, these other labels of tradition and which religion do they belong to is not as important, because they have managed to, they're then in a sense tapping into a particular experience, right? Which is the experience of that. One way of putting it is the experience of shunyata or emptiness, which is a Buddhist concept. And if they're experiencing that, right, they've managed to collapse subject-object duality, they're experiencing that. Like Kabir says, Kabir has this poem which he talks about drinking from the same well, right? So even though the pot bearers may be many, are they in fact drinking from the same well? And that's a question that I'm posing. Right? So if you have managed to collapse subject-object duality, right, then does it matter whether you're a Buddha or a Kabir? And are you then drinking essentially from the same well? Are you having, and in a certain way, are you tapping into the same experience? And can it be like someone from can it be you from a Christian tradition, if you've collapsed subject-object duality and you're accessing that kind of plane of consciousness, are you tapping into the same experience that a Kabir experienced the same experience that that a Buddha experienced. That's a very sort of, it's a much longer conversation and discussion. But, and I understand where your question also comes from, because in Buddhism there is no God, right? There is no soul. So in that sense, it's a very, the Dalai Lama in fact sometimes describes it as a science of the mind. Yeah. So, yeah. Do you all have any further responses, questions? Because, yeah, so go ahead.
When should we begin to question the construction of the I? Say, for example, or when should we wake up? When should we wake up that the I that I have constructed to make meaning for my life has begun to, I'm going to become a captive of that I. So when should we, as you said, all of us have this kind of a necessary impulse to construct I, and at the same time construct the non-I's. Okay, now we, like it or not, we want to make meaning out of this world, and therefore we construct these I's and non-I's. So when should we wake up? When should I realize that the I that I have constructed, instead of helping me, is actually making me a captive of that I? So what are the kind of signals that I should wake up? Now, I am not, the I I have created, I'm going to be imprisoned by this I. So when should I wake up?
Yeah, so to respond to that, yeah, so one thing is, adolescence is a great time to sometimes, because in childhood, you're more sort of absorbing, you're learning, you're encountering new ideas, you're obeying what people are telling you, right? And sometimes, so adolescence perhaps is a good time for you to then begin to question, begin to think, begin to reevaluate, and try and make sense of who you are, that big who am I question. But what you're pointing to was also, at what point do we, and that's something for each of us to reflect on, right? Because sometimes life experience does that to you. Sometimes a session like this might do it to you. Sometimes it's a poem that you've read that, so when does that, at what point in your life do you begin to question the fabrication, right? You begin to sort of poke holes in it, right? And it can be rather terrifying, because it's like it's like tugging at a thread of a larger tapestry that you have created. And as you tug on that thread, the whole tapestry kind of unravels, right? So at what point do you begin that journey of starting to answer the questions, right? And one point, like you yourself suggested, was when you begin to realize the harm that it's causing you, the immense suffering that it's causing you, right? And human life, all of us have experienced suffering, right? Some of us may have experienced deep loss and deep suffering. Don't we want to find a way out of that suffering, right? And perhaps when you realize how this constructing of the I is linked to the personal suffering that you're causing yourself, to try and then question it, reevaluate, try and look at it from a different perspective, yeah, because so think of even something as simple as an impermanence, again, something that Buddhism and Kabir both talk about. When you realize that you're impermanent, right? When you realize that the objects and the people around you are impermanent, right? And you truly understand impermanence, then when your phone falls down and cracks or something, or something else happens, right? You are better equipped to sort of deal with it and make sense of it, right? It no longer shocks you because you understand the nature of your world as impermanence, right? So your suffering is then reduced. Yeah. So when you realize, so of course you'll have to test it out in your own experience, where by questioning your constructions of I, because think of, isn't it a lot of work to constantly be constructing the sense of who am I, this question of identity that you have to put out into the world, and it can be rather exhausting, which is why Kabir talks about it, in fact, like as a heavy burden, as a heavy load, and it is something that is stopping you from love, right? Which is why he says that the path is so narrow. Why are you carrying this heavy burden of identity, right? And you will keep slipping on the path. Yeah, and which is why he says two swords, one scabbard cannot fit in that sense, right? So again, pointing to non-duality. So there's a certain, yeah, so it just blocks you from the path of love. It blocks you from the path of your own spiritual evolution, your own enlightenment, and your own, you just continue to sort of wander in samsara and you continue to suffer. So I don't know what that inciting moment is for each of you and what it would be for each of you in each of your lives. But there are moments when you suddenly, it could be just looking at yourself in the mirror, right? And suddenly you realize that you can see the construction of the self, yeah? And, but more often than not, we just brush it aside. We don't want to go there, right? We want to hold on and in fact, continue to build a very solid self, right? We don't, because then we don't know how we would navigate, we don't know who we are, right? And we find that extremely terrifying, yeah.
Thank you, ma'am, for your good presentation. I think the whole point in the presentation, I think the key issue is what mind is, how the human mind constructs oneself, one's own perspective, I, and how it constructs the outer world. Now the last question, what is mind after all? Is it awareness, consciousness? Is it a neurobiological process in the brain? That clarity has to be made. Otherwise, it's confusing. What should be we have to get out of it? Secondly, my question is, in the cognizing process, I cognize something. There will be always a subject-object distinction. Otherwise, how are you able to cognize it? The going about beyond that or completely despising this endeavor will be a collapse of whole epistemology. How you could come to the derived knowledge?
Yeah, so in fact, sometimes there's that idea of, so of course you need the mind to cognize, you need the mind to sort of make sense of the world, but what Buddhism and Kabir are also pointing to is perhaps can we get to a place where there is no mind? And Laldev also talks about it, right? So, which is why there's a sense of Kabir has lost his mind, right? And what happens then? What happens when, and then how then do you make sense of the world without that kind of subject-object distinction? And which is why Buddhism also talks about something called non-conceptual thought. What does it mean to think without concepts? What is non-conceptual thought? What kind of thought are they talking about? Yeah, and Laldev also, so, and there's a certain sense where you've crossed the field of emptiness, you've reached this other side, and they struggle, as poets, they struggle to kind of describe that to you because it's exactly like you said, our only way of operating from the world is this kind of subject-object duality, right? This sense of separation, right? What happens when that collapses? Which is why Kabir describes it like there's a pot there's water in the pot that's in the river. When that pot breaks, what happens, right? The water mingles with the water, or again he describes it like a drop merging with the ocean, right? What happens at that point? What happens to the self? What happens to the mind? What happens to thought itself? Which is why they call it that Shunya Shikhar, right? That peak of emptiness. And to describe it also, I mean, you have the Anhad Bhaje. So there's a certain sense where they try and describe even that, where he says, there is this cave in which there is this man, but he doesn't have any hands and legs, right? And so what is he, right? What has happened at that point? Yeah, and which is why you look at the stages of Buddhist meditation. So they represent it in various ways. And at the top, you're just like flying in the sky, right? What has happened to the mind at that point of time? So, I mean, and that's something, because I haven't experienced it. And again, and which is why I keep coming back to the finger pointing to the moon. They, through their poetry, and I can read out some examples of that poetry, trying to describe this exact experience. Yeah? But the poem, again, because it's in language, and language is very limiting, right? It's not the experience itself, because the experience itself is beyond thought. It's beyond language. It's not something that you can put down. It's only something that you can that you can experience. I know it sounds in the sense that I'm evasive in that sense, but that is how they describe it, this idea of non-conceptual thought, right? And it's something that we can't even understand because we are trying to make sense of it through language, right? And we're trying to describe in language something that is beyond thought, that is beyond language, right? Which is why one example I can give you is when you talk about Brahman, for instance, right? You can't tell me what Brahman is, which is why the whole neti approach. Why is that? But why is it that Brahman cannot be described? So this kind of experience again is indescribable. Yet as poets and as mystic saints, they try and describe it to you. And I'll come in the second half, then I'll talk also about something called Ulat Bamsi, which is upside down language that Kabir uses, because he says, I can't describe it in sort of the regular language, right? So I have to turn language itself on its head to describe something that is beyond language. Yeah.
Okay, Father Stephen also wants to ask, so any more interactions? Like those, okay, the last 3 questions, okay.
Thank you very much, ma'am, for your wonderful lecture, the lecture 1. Yeah, the moment you took the name of Kabir, I was happy, because I also suppose most of us are happy because we know Kabir right from our childhood. He's in our books, textbooks, Kabir ke dohe, what I was thinking is, as you were narrating just now also you said, and Kabir being a mystic, he talks about things in a paradoxical way, the drop is in the water, yet the drop is in the ocean, yet the ocean is in the drop, and so on. And also Laldeep, I'm not quite familiar with that, yet she also talks about things in a paradoxical way. And also I would definitely talk about this Eckhart, who is I suppose he's a German theologian. He talks about God as being and non-being at the same time, asking his followers to pursue God beyond God. So this understanding of reality as a paradox is always surprising to me and interesting to me. My question to you is that...
is it a separate question or can I respond to this? Because is it related to this? Yeah, okay, go ahead.
My question to you is that, is the reality so incomprehensible and paradoxical in your opinion? I know it's not very easy to answer, it's very complex to answer realities and so on, but in your opinion, what do you believe? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And this is something that all religious traditions sort of grapple with and struggle with, right? Sometimes to understand reality and to describe reality, because, and sometimes you use satire, you use ridicule, you use impossibilities, you use achambas, you use paradoxes, because you're trying to describe something that, suppose I as Laldev have had this particular experience of enlightenment. How do I describe it to someone who hasn't had that experience? And how do I describe it through language? So sometimes I need these kind of paradoxes, I need this kind of ulat bamsi. In Zen also you have something called koans, right? The sound of one hand clapping, standing yet sitting, empty-handed yet holding a hoe. So all of these, what are they trying to do here? What are they doing to your mind, right? Our mind likes things to be easy and clear and we're not comfortable with uncertainties. It's something called that, since you all quoted Keats as well, Keats talks about something called negative capability, right? So staying with the mystery, staying with the uncertainty, without this irritable reaching after fact and reason. But the mind is not comfortable with uncertainty. We're not comfortable with mystery. We're not comfortable with paradox. So why is it that these mystics are using, and even in Marathi Bhakti as well, you have someone like Muktabai, right? She talks about the ant that swallowed the sun. Yeah. So why is it that they're using these kinds of? It's raining heavily, yet not a single drop falls. Yeah. What is it doing? What does it do to your mind, right? And so they're trying to break through. What are they trying to break through? These concepts that you have, right? These easy concepts, labels, your understanding of reality. So they're trying to break through those conceptual elaborations by trying to fox your mind, confuse your mind. The son came first and then the father. That's a Kabir poem, right? it's turning all your understanding of conventional relationships, and some of the things, I'm not going to quote, some of the things that Kabir says are outrageous, are scandalous, are unconventional, right? So your conventional understanding of the world is also being questioned, right? And that creates discomfort. And sometimes that mind needs a discomfort for it to be challenged, for it to be able to turn itself on its head, for you to begin to, like Father said, for you to begin to suddenly wake up. Sometimes that paradox might do it for you, right? Which is why you're just meant to stay with that Zen koan, for instance, and stay with it and stay with it and stay with it till you gain enlightenment. Suddenly it all makes sense, which is why Kabir says only 1 in 1,000 will understand this. All those examples that you gave, right? Not everyone will understand it. Some people will stand up and say, this is all rubbish, it doesn't make any sense, and walk off, right? Someone else hearing it might gain enlightenment. Yeah? So not everyone will understand, and which is why, and on one hand, that question that you asked, is it complex? Not really. Actually, it's really simple. It's just a shift in perception. What is enlightenment? Right? We don't need to sort of make it complicated. If you're able to it's just sometimes the hand changing, right? So it's sometimes just a shift in perception. So which is why it's dal and rice before enlightenment, dal and rice after enlightenment. But what has fundamentally changed is your mind. There's a shift in perception in how you see yourself and the world and other people. Yeah? So it doesn't have to be complex. And sometimes people gain enlightenment after many, many lifetimes. Sometimes it comes in an instant, right? But from what I understand it's fundamentally that shift in perception. Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Mandana, for the wonderful presentation. I'm Joshua. I'm a first-year licentiate student. I have 2 questions. The second one is a spin-off of the first question. So my first question is, the constant theme that ran throughout your talk was like getting liberated from the I, from the self, which is also prevalent in most of the Indian philosophies, Eastern philosophies, to be liberated from the self and the I, which is a wonderful idea, but I'm just wondering, is that possible in principle when the I is very evident? The I is all that I have. So is that possible in principle? And the second question is, if I am not being assertive, if I'm not being expressive of the I, of the self, am I not making myself more vulnerable to discrimination, which is quite prevalent in this subcontinent? So, yeah.
So again, it's not saying that you make, so this is how I'll respond to it, that when you understand the nature of your mind and reality, doesn't mean that you step outside of the world. There's this whole idea of socially engaged Buddhism, right? You're very much for social justice, you're very much dealing with human rights issues, etc., right? It's not a separation or a divorce from the world. In fact, you are more fully immersed in it, right? The only difference is, like Laldet says, that I'm in the water, I'm immersed in water, yet my dress does not get wet, right? You're able to sort of lick honey off the edge of a knife, but not get cut, because you understand the nature of your mind and you understand the nature of reality, right? And so of course so Buddhism has something called conventional truth and ultimate truth. So conventional truth is also a truth, right? But it's not ultimately true. So it's not saying, so you navigate in this conventional world, but you understand the story, you understand the constructions, you understand, you know the way, how to get out of suffering, right? So it in fact makes you navigate the world more skillfully, because you understand the nature of mind and reality, right? So it's not about getting out of the world, and conventionally you might have, so which is why Buddhism doesn't necessarily, right now I have put it all together, but it's meant to be stages. So you begin with conventional truth, you deal with suffering at that conventional level, and it's a progressive path, right? So as you evolve in your journey, you move towards the ultimate, right? And you understand the nature of the conventional reality, and you're no longer sort of trapped by the suffering that it causes you. So, but you very much, you have Buddhists who are very, very much engaged in the world, engaged in social activism and human rights issues. And in fact, and for them, it is, I mean, the alleviation of suffering on those levels as well is something that deeply concerns them, right? The suffering of the other is something that deeply, deeply moves the Buddhist, right? So it's not about not being assertive, but it's about when you understand the nature of reality, you don't suffer. And you're able to kind of skillfully navigate the conventional world. Yeah, it doesn't mean that you step outside of it, because that's not saying that you have to go into a cave and meditate. You have to be part of the conventional world, and for the sake of the conventional world, you will have a name, you will have an identity, but you understand its nature. You're not trapped by it. It's not causing you suffering. It's not causing someone else suffering. You can use it as a tool to navigate the world, but you're not limited and constricted by it.
Thank you, ma'am, for your interesting presentation, also interesting conversation. Just a comment, not a question. Chaco asked, what is mind finally? Doesn't matter. And what is matter? Never mind. I just want to make a comment. See, usually we think that only self, consciousness, and mind is a big thing. Today, science is wondering what matter is. Yeah. And it matters a lot, isn't it? And many of the quantum physicists have great mystical inclinations. Yeah. For example, David Bohm says, the core of I, that I within inverted commas, can never be approached by any science. They say neuroscience or bureau-science, whatever it may be. So the point is, today the quantum physics and more particle physics and all, they'll go into the non-dual nature of matter. It's neither wave nor particle and so on. Whereas philosophy of science can help you more in this regard. So we encourage you, that's why in JD, to study philosophy of science. Also, we have a licentiate program on science and religion. So after your undergraduate program, you can come for that PG. Thank you.
Yeah. Right. And so then in fact, there are lots of conferences. If you just Google, there are lots of conferences these days on quantum mechanics and Buddhism. So you have these two sort of realms.
And it's time up. So thank you, ma'am. It's already close the time, so maybe you can have a personal chat with ma'am. Okay, thank you one and all. With this, we mark the end of session 1. Over to you, MC.
Thank you all for the lively discussion and meaningful arguments. It's a wonderful engagement. We now take a short break. Kindly present here by sharp 11 a.m. as we are preparing for the second session. Thank you all. Mind marvels the man, when world wonders the mind. Welcome back everyone to this second session on philosophies of resistance and freedom, exploring Buddhist and mystic poetry. As we are going to start the second session, we also welcome the students from Symbiosis School for Liberal Arts. Let's put our hands together and welcome them. Once again, let us welcome Professor Gayatri to continue to share her wisdom with us.
All right. Right, so just to pick up from where we left off, so in the engagement with the world, the mind actively produces thoughts through which it fashions inside itself the conception of its world, which it engages with sometimes as a final reality, right? So that's what we were discussing in the first half, in terms of how the mind actively fabricates its world, right? So thus, studying the nature of the mind offers insights into the nature of these constructed worlds. And why is it important for us to understand it, study it, and understand not just our own constructions, but constructions of how other people construct their worlds, is because then we can sort of find a way to talk to each other, to dialogue with each other, to find common ground, to find solutions. So the thoughts that we have of our reality and that we come to believe are both handed down as prefabricated narratives and emerge as active co-constructions of creations with and for others, right? So to understand these constructions, where have your ideas, where have your belief systems, where have your values, where has your sense of who you are, the whole who am I question, your identity construction, your ego identity, where has that come from? Right? And to understand that it's not something that has come out of nowhere, right? It's something that, whether it's family, whether it's religion, whether it's country, so all of these ideas, right? The conversations that you've had, the books that you've read, how have you constructed a sense of who you are, right? So the delusion is truth, both as individual and collective constructions, exist within a system within which it is maintained and rewarded, right? So which is why Father was asking, at what point do you wake up? At what point do you realize that one needs to start asking questions about the I? Because throughout your life, you're just taught to continue to sort of create these constructions, build these constructions, and it's rewarded, right? So you have a strong, that's what Brother was also asking in terms of but one needs to be assertive. One needs to put oneself out there. One needs to sort of have a sense of identity in order to be able to do that, right? So very often we live in a world in which that is rewarded, right? And in an extremely, sometimes extremely individualistic world as well, right? So our perceptions of our reality, of course, why we are having this whole conversation is because it impacts how we engage in the world. Deluded misperceptions of reality color our constructions of other people and entangle us in a social relations, us and our social relations in a sticky web of errors, right? And when we talk about caste, when we talk about hierarchies, when we talk about classes, right? What happens when each of us have very strong identities? When you talk about religion, so and how then do we treat and navigate these spaces? These frameworks and narratives become dangerous when we perceive them as the only reality, right? And to somehow think that my reality is the only reality, right? And your reality is somehow different. And how do we deal with the different? How does a nation deal with difference? How do families deal with difference? How do we deal with something that we don't understand, that is different from us, right? Something that you can't quite make sense of, someone whose worldview is very different from your own, right? How do we deal with that? So Charles Hallisey is someone who's translated the Therigatha. So he writes, habitual mental projections and deep unsavory dispositions are all causal factors in the ways that we construct and experience the world around us and prompts us to action that brings about our own ruin and suffering. right? So the whole point of having this conversation is that we don't want to go into this place where we are ruined and we suffer, right? And sometimes, would we also be capable of socially sanctioned violence? Would we be sometimes find ourselves, if we are not critical enough and not vigilant enough, what would we be capable of doing to protect our sense of identity and our ego, right? So our perception of, so thus in a world that we share with others, we need to understand these mental projections. The nature of the mind has to be investigated, and the only way to understand the nature of the mind is to investigate it inside out. The mind needs to probe its depths to encounter these active fabrications and rend, which is why I call it rending the veil of delusion, right? There's almost violence implied, but there's a sense of you have to wrestle that demon, right? You have to rend the veil of delusion, to be able to see things as they really are, right? Why? Because these fabrications are so powerful, they're so strong. You've spent a lifetime constructing a sense of self. Buddhism invites us to analyze and question our delusions and co-constructed creations. The goal is to institute a radical shift in perspective to see things as they really are. And why should we see things as they... So currently we are seeing things through the lens of delusion, through the veil of delusion. When you're able to see things as they really are, then you institute greater livability, love, and freedom for all, right? And which is why we keep coming back to love. Kabir keeps coming back to love, right? So to be able to love fully, to be able to be free, to be able to allow for greater livability, this is the only way to do it. We are not often, and what is very interesting about Buddhism is it's not offering you a set of dogmas. It's not saying that this is the only way that you have to follow, right? It allows, there's a space, and you're not expected to follow. In fact, Buddha is not asking you to follow him blindly, right? But what is Buddhism offering you? Because it's a 2,500-year history of investigating the nature of the mind. It is offering you techniques to inquire into the nature of your mind, into the nature of reality, and to do it through first-person investigation and meditation, right? So like I said, there is one way that, and like Father Stephen said, sometimes to understand the world, to understand matter, you look at external reality, right? But the way that Buddhism is talking about is to look at this kind of internal reality through first-person investigation. So no one else can do it for you. For the Buddhist path, the mere blind memorization of doctrines and theories serve no purpose, right? And that's what Kabir is saying, that's what Lal Ded is saying, just chanting mantras, just kind of following rituals, engaging in animal sacrifice, lighting pyres, all of that is not going to really free you. Yeah, so Buddha is again against all of this kind of ritual worship in that sense. Right? And very blind memorization of text, just parroting, just memorizing, but not really understanding anything about what the philosophy is, right? So you might, which is why Kabir makes a lot of fun of pundits, right, and scholars, right? That just reading, the whole world went blind, right? But you didn't come any closer to enlightenment, right? You were not, and like Lal Ded said, I was not able to dispel the duality from my mind. Right? So just reading and becoming a scholar and understanding theory and being armchair philosophers is not what Kabir and Buddha and Lal Ded are talking about. Yeah, so as Galen Strawson, another scholar, writes, one can't simply abolish one's sense of individuality by some sort of effortless, rationally motivated, self-directed intellectual fiat, right? You can't sit, and you have to do it through meditation. And so of course, begin with first-person investigation, right? Insight, which is why you have shamatha meditation, but you also have insight meditation, right? But just trying to, you can't rationally abolish the self. You can't just sit and, it's not a logical kind of equation that you can sort of work out. Right? It's something that you have to do in these kinds of stages, right? Through the path of meditation. You can't just intellectualize it and have a lot of fun in your head and think that, you've understood it, right? Because experience, whether it's Lal Ded, Kabir, Buddha, experience is very, very important, right? And sometimes there's a point where Lal Ded says, when you're crossing the field of emptiness, you have to drop your reason and your senses. Yeah, so just intellectualizing it is not going to be, because finally you're arriving at a place, like I said, which is beyond thought, which is beyond language, right? So sitting and just kind of theorizing this whole thing and is not going to give you any answers, right? Thus, engaging with these insights invites a seeker to place, and which is why you have to place yourself, your own mind, as well as your experiential phenomenological engagement with the world and your experience of reality under systemic investigation, right? So you're placing your mind, your experience of the world, you're investigating it, you're asking questions of it, you're probing into it, and then you're going into meditation, right? So they're not discounting theory, but you have to go beyond that as well. Because Buddhism's great key concept is this idea of shunyata or emptiness, right? And at one point, Nagarjuna tells us that emptiness is also empty, right? So go beyond that. So if you try and hold on to that concept, he's asking you to give this very, very key concept, give that up as well. Yeah, so there's nothing really to hold on to. So if you're looking for comfort, if you're looking for easy answers, if you're, all of that, Buddha's not, you have to figure it out yourself. You have to do the work. Yeah. So that's why Ricard reminds us that, so Dalai Lama also talks about, like I said, the Buddhism as a science of the mind. And this Suzuki, again, a Zen monk and teacher, the purpose of studying Buddhism is not to study Buddhism, but to study ourselves, right? It's an intense kind of understanding of yourself, right? And your mind. So meditation, which is why meditation becomes very key. So meditation offers us the tools to rend the self-grasping ignorance and the habitual patterns of conditioning to cultivate greater freedom. So we are talking about rending the delusion of the self. How do we do it? We do it through meditation. Yeah? So Laldet says, some renounce their home and some their hermitage. All is futile if the mind is not under control. Yeah? So you think, if you go and meditate in a cave, if you can't control your mind, if you haven't been able to dispel duality, what's the point, right? So you might be in a hermitage, you might be in a seminary, you might be sort of in these other kinds of spaces, right? But if you haven't been able to dispel duality, what's the point? All is futile. If the mind is not under control. So Laldet says it's much easier to study than act, to philosophize than to go actually looking for the self. Losing the scriptures in the thick fog of my practice, I stumbled on second sight. Yeah? So losing the scriptures themselves, I was able to see. Yeah? So you begin with the scriptures, you begin with theory, but finally it's your own insight, it's your own experience that is the real test. Says Kabir, I say what I see with my own eyes. You say what is written on paper. How is my mind and your mind ever going to meet? Yeah, and this is something as students of philosophy to sometimes think about, right? Sometimes we get very excited by new ideas and new theories and new terms and new concepts, right? But it's so much easier to study than to act. Yeah, it's very easy to be an armchair philosopher, right? And look at what Kabir, and this is a challenge for Kabir, he's trying to describe an experience which he has had, which you have not had. But also this question of how is my mind and your mind ever going to meet? So just reading Kabir's poetry is also of no use. Wallace reminds us that the Buddhist path is optimistic and pragmatic, declaring that these sources of bondage are not inherent to our existence, but may be dispelled through sustained and skillful practice, right? So while it paints a very gloomy picture in terms of we are deluded and we are suffering and we are in dukkha, it doesn't just stay there, right? So while one of the noble truths may be the truth of dukkha, it's also giving you the way out of it. So it's extremely pragmatic, right? And very optimistic. You don't have to continue to remain in samsara. You don't have to continue to remain in suffering. You don't need to continue to remain in delusion. In deep meditative states, the dismantling of the self is and the self you experience is ephemeral, right? And you shed it. Thus, through meditation, we can free ourselves from erroneous beliefs, misguided desires, and self-defeating action to attain total mental freedom. And again, it's only through your own efforts. Right? Your freedom is in your hands. No one else can do it for you. No one else can sort of conduct this investigation, this analysis, this meditation. Thus, the Buddhist path enables a practitioner to overcome their own delusions and unwholesome mental states. I think I just have water. Yeah. So the central insight for Buddhism is that total mental freedom is possible in nirvana, right? So this is what Buddhism is offering you, the cessation of suffering and total mental freedom. So, yeah. So again, talking about the alarming mental health issues around the world, and the very root of our suffering again, and all our mental health issues stem from this illusory self. So we are reminded that the primary delusion is the intense clinging to the self. This delusion is a basis for our unreflective orientation to the world and one of self-grasping ignorance that seeks possession and speaks in terms of I and mine, right? Look at how so often when you're making decisions, when you're having experiences, when you're talking, how often you talk about and navigate the world from this whole idea of what is yours and what is mine. The self is demonstrated to be mind. So what Buddhism is saying is it's a conceptual fiction. It's mind sprung. It's something that your mind has constructed, right? And we're imposing that conceptual fiction on this mind-body complex, right? So just as we're calling that a table, we're imposing a label on this object. When it comes to your mind and body, we're imposing this idea of an I, of a self. The self is demonstrated. Yeah, so Repeti reminds us that this negative realization, everything is empty of self-nature, is conceived as life-affirming and maximally liberating, right? So I don't know how some of you all are engaging with this idea right now. Is it a terrifying thought? And this idea of once the self is abolished, right? Once the self ceases to exist, is that a terrifying thought? Are we ready to let go of this identity that we've constructed of who we are? And because Buddhism, of course, perceives it as maximally liberating, right? But you can see how if it's not taught well, it can also be extremely nihilistic, right? Because if the self is not there, then it means that then I can do whatever I want. There is no God, there is no moral judging, no moral governor of my actions, there is no soul. So does it mean that I can do whatever I want, right? So striking at the heart of the ego identity, so that's why it has to be done with what Buddhism calls upaya kaushala, right? Essentially skillful means. Because it can go in this very nihilistic way where people are like, if there's no self, then does anything even matter, right? And you have a very nihilistic worldview. So if Buddhist dharma is thus offered to practitioners progressively, right? That's why I said you begin with conventional understanding and then you arrive at the ultimate. You progress from the simple to the complex. The idea of a conventional self, because suddenly asking people to give up the conventional self can be terrifying, right? So you begin with the conventional self and you slowly dismantle it through meditative insight to arrive at the self as insubstantial, right? And to come to, you all were speaking about, how we use language. So you look at upside down language, you look at Ulat Bamsi, right? So what is Kabir doing with Ulat Bamsi is a subversion of language, subversion of content, of concept. So all your regular habitual ways of seeing things are then questioned, right? Your conventional understandings. Yeah? We are caught in delusion in an upside down reality. Hence, Ulat Bamsi corrects that perspective. And realize when you talk about these paradoxes, and you all gave examples in the first half as well, right? This is not something that your mind can really solve. And it cannot be solved with your mind. So as long as you're trying to solve the paradox with your mind, you'll never get the answer. Right? Finally, you have to go beyond the mind. So, yeah. So to just keep that in mind, as long as you're trying to solve the paradox with your mind, no answer. So Kabir reminds us that Kabir pounds away with questions, prods with riddles, stirs with challenges, shocks with insults, disorients with verbal feints. Right? He's shocking. Some of the things that he says are outrageous because he wants to wake you up. He wants to shock you. He wants you to be outraged. He wants your mind to be uncomfortable, right? And he shows you the absurdity of life. He shows you the foolishness of your delusions, yeah? So, and that's in those moments, you're able to see through it. For a moment, you suddenly see that Kabir is beginning to make sense, right? Something that you held on to when you thought was real, when he questions it and he shows you how foolish it is, what happens to you? Yeah? So, which is why all of these inverted images, like a lion slithers through the ocean, the sky is tied and hurled to the underworld, an elephant is tied to an ant's foot, and we conjure all these images in our mind. Yeah? A fish jumps out of the ocean and builds a house on the beach. Yeah? So Kabir uses a lot of this ambiguity, multiplicity, absurdity of life, right? He's trying to turn everything inside out. So that you can see through the label. It turns language and convention on its head. Yeah? So it is the mind looking at itself. Okay. So I think we had a chance to discuss that in the Q&A, so I'll move on to this. So now let's get to this whole idea of no self. This very key Buddhist concept called anatta, right? Which translates as no self. So like I said, there's no Atman, there's no soul, there's no eternal kind of autonomous entity, there's no immaterial entity, right? And yeah, so I think yeah. So I'm just very quickly going to talk about 3 ways in which, and you all can reflect on this and think about this in your own time, of why is Buddhism saying that there is no self, right? What evidence are they giving you? What examples are they giving you? So one is the idea, you all may have heard of the 5 aggregates, right? Of the 5 skandhas, right? Which is your mind-body complex, right? Of form, feeling, perception, volitional formations, consciousness, right? This entire mind-body complex that you have given the label of a self. What is this? How do you understand it? What kind of being is this, right? And it's both physical, because we are both matter and consciousness, right? So we're both mind and matter. So that sense of the physical and the psychological are sort of woven together. And so when you bundle these things together, it's called all these skandhas, right? Some of which are psychological, some of which are physical. You have put the label of the self on it. So Charles Hallisey says, instead of seeing a person in terms of a soul, of an enduring self, or some form of stable personal identity, early Buddhist teaching redescribed what makes a person a group of things and events, bundled together, codependent on the others, the parts and the whole of the person constantly changing, right? So all of these mental, if you're made of consciousness and matter, is there anything permanent there? Is there anything eternal? Because again, there's no soul here, right? So for Buddhism, there's nothing, everything is impermanent, everything is in flux, everything is constantly changing. So there is no inherent existence, right? Because your mind, you have new ideas, you have new thoughts, your body is changing. So in that sense, what is the self? When you say I, you've put the label of the I on something that is inherently unstable, inherently in flux, inherently changing, right? So Buddhism highlights the empty, impermanent, fleeting nature of self and phenomena. Everything, not only just you, but everything all around you is also impermanent, is also fleeting, is also constantly changing. So nothing is permanent. Nothing inherently exists by itself. Everything is dependent on something else. For the table to exist, for me to exist, other things had to come into existence, right? I can't exist just like that. Right? So there are all of these, and there are impermanent things that have caused my existence, right? So I am also impermanent in that sense. So, right. So it demonstrates that the phenomena are in a constant state of transience. So everything is dream-like. Everything is mind-made in nature, right? Nothing is fixed. Nothing is permanent. And Kabir also talks about this, right? He has no shortage of metaphors for the body and its imminent disintegration. And he talks a lot about death. He talks about how your hair will burn on the funeral pyre, right? Just like hay, right? And he describes that. So he says, the body is a house whose walls are made of sand. It's a ball of paper that melts in the rain. It is a glass bangle that just breaks. It is a drop of dew. It's there and it's gone. So he's constantly talking about death. He's constantly talking about impermanence, right? And why are you so arrogant? Why are you sort of so obsessed with your body? Why do you put all of these, why do you beautify it and put all of these creams, etc., right? What is the body, right? And there are lots of Buddhist meditative practices also that require you to meditate on the dying body, on the decaying body, right? On the body with all its unsavory aspects, right? And what is it that you're clinging on to? What is it that you're so obsessed by? The nature of this body is impermanent. Yeah. So this constant kind of idea of impermanence and flux is what both Buddhism and Kabir talk about, or like you all quoted Heraclitus as well, right? So you can't step into the same river twice, for instance, right? So all of these ideas, this is the nature of your existence. Yeah, like a glass bangle, like a drop of dew. He cautions us against taking pride in the body, reminding us of its impermanence. He says, just let a little breeze hit, a little gust, and the body turns to dust. Yeah, so you're reminded. I mean, it's not, for us, it's dust we are, and to dust we shall go back to, right? So that constant reminder of what the body is, right? So in Buddhism, the impermanence and constantly changing nature of all that is conventionally designated, right? Everything lacks so there's no enduring essence, there's no swabhava, right? There's no intrinsic existence. Everything, and not intrinsic because it's dependent on other things for its existence. It doesn't exist, nothing exists just by itself. And nothing remains in that state, right? We're constantly changing. So, yeah. So Halasi again, so Therigatha we spoke about 2000, so again, it's written 2000 years ago in the Pali language by the first Buddhist nuns, right? So one example, so Vijaya says in the Therigatha, 7 days after splitting open the mass of mental darkness, I stretched out my feet. So all of them talk about the struggle with the mind, the struggle with suffering, the struggle with impermanence, right? Laldet says, control the mind horse. The mind is described as a horse, as a kunjara elephant, as, is described as like a monkey, right? Because it's so difficult to rein it. But she says, control the mind horse with the reins of wisdom. So when we talk about impermanence, it's a very fierce investigation of the nature of your own body and mind, right? Battling with its restless tricks. So again, Sakula from the Therigatha, she says, I saw my experiences as if they were not my own. Born from a cause, destined to disappear, I got rid of all that fouls the heart, right? So she's let go of that sense of ego identity. Laldet says, I wrestled with the darkness inside me, knocked it down, clawed at it, ripped it to shreds, right? Which is why this kind of rending of the veil. It takes a lot of efforts engaging with your own mind, right? So that is one, the idea of the 5 aggregates, right? When you look at what is it that actually makes up the body, both the mental and the psychological and the physical, and you see it, and you understand it. So what are you calling self? So that's the first strategy. The second strategy is the idea of conceptual imputation, right? Where basically you're putting a label on something. So in other words, the I does not exist on its own right, independently from its own side. When we see that existence of the self is a mere conceptual imputation, the self is just a concept that you have put, a label that you have put on the body, right? Attachment to this illusion ceases, and this dissolves the barriers of separation and leads to a mystical experience of union with all and the state of profound bliss, right? I'll come to that later. The third strategy is something called pratitya samutpada, which is dependent origination. Nothing exists independently, like I've said. Everything has come together because of previous causes. So why do you say that you exist permanently, right? So this is a Buddhist doctrine that elaborates that the nature of all things is dependently originated, right? And what are you dependently originated from? Impermanent causes and conditions. Everything that is in this room today, from the Buddhist perspective, has come from impermanent causes and conditions. So where is the permanence, right? Where is the self? So Bianca, again, another Buddhist scholar, dependent origination is the understanding that phenomena do not exist as independent entities that can be isolated, right? But rather as momentary forms whose existence is entirely dependent on their relationships to other phenomena and the conceptual labels that we impute on them, right? So there's this whole network of relationships. You don't exist in a vacuum, right? You exist in the way that you do because so many different causes and conditions had to come together. So even the phone that you have, right? The phone, there's so many different causes and conditions. It doesn't exist just like that, right? So all of these different causes and conditions are themselves impermanent, yeah? So, So insight into anatta or no self enables impartial judgment that is not clouded by the self or driven by self-centered desires, right? So when you begin to question the self, then you no longer place yourself at the center of your world, right? So you don't become self-obsessed, self-absorbed, self-centered in that sense, right? You have an enlarged mentality. Your understanding of the world has expanded. It's no longer limited and constricted So we are no longer constrained by desire, fear, and attachment. When you understand that everything is impermanent, your attachment to objects also, you're no longer shocked, right? When someone passes away, right? Or when the phone falls and cracks, right? Because we understand the nature of impermanence. We understand the nature, which is why there's fearlessness. You're not afraid of death because you understand the nature of the world, right? So Peldon writes, when the non-existence of I is realized, and why am I harping on the non-existence of I? Because then the notion of the other also disappears, for the simple reason that the other is posited in relation to the thought of the I, right? That whole subject-object duality. You understand the other because there's an I. So if you question the I and you're able to you're no longer gripped by the story of the I, then your understanding of the other automatically changes, right? So, and which is why Kabir says, which is false? Is the Quran false? Or are the Vedas false? He says, false is a darkened view. It's one in everybody. How did you make it two? Yeah? So, which is why you said, is it complex? It's actually really simple, right? But we have made it complex because of language, because of identity constructions, because of all of these ideas of dualities and levels of separation, right? For him, it's very simple. What is false is a darkened view. It's one in everybody. How did you make it two? So Kabir says, Hindus die muttering Ram. Muslims die chanting Khuda. Kabir says, one really lives who never enters into duality. Right? You're outside of the cycle of death and rebirth. You're outside of samsara if you've managed to get outside of the cycle of this understanding of duality. Right? Otherwise, you will keep dying. You will keep suffering. You will keep being reborn. You will cycle from lifetime to lifetime in delusion. Yeah? When Kabir speaks of love, there is no difference between self and other. Even in Christianity, right? When you talk about love, if there is separation, if there is difference, what kind of love is that, right? For the categories themselves have ceased to exist. I, mine, yours, all of this is ignorance, all of this is illusion, all of this is an error of perception. In Hinduism also sometimes Maya is described like that, right? As this error of perception, as a separation between self and other. Yeah? So when there is no difference between self and other, there is love. So Kabir says, if all me and mine ended, there would be a free space when the mind becomes still and it finds its resting place. Right? Of course, we go to a place where there is no mind as well, right? But like I said, that's why it's stages. But now you're free. You're free from the burden of constructing a self. You're free from the burden of duality. You're free from hatred. You're free from fear, right? Because there is no separation. So, says Kabir, get drunk on love and rid your head of duality. Such a delicate path to tread, why lug a heavy load on your head? Right? The path of love is narrow, it's tricky, it's slippery. And if you're going to carry this huge, big burden of the self, you're going to keep slipping, right? So, and this, again, a Buddhist poem by a Dakini. She says, if there is no duality, there is no bondage. There is no bondage. If there is nothing to identify, there are no obscurations. There's nothing blocking your path, your view. You're able to see things as they really are. There are no obscurations. If there is no self and other, there is no desire or hatred. If there's nothing to mind, right? No mind, there is no distraction. And you are free. You're in that state of luminosity and bliss. Another poem by Yogini. So non-dual mind is like water poured into water. See, and that is what you all were asking in the Q&A, right? What is that experience like? So it's like water poured into water. Don't impair its nature. No matter how the monkeys of experience may come up, how could they pervade the sky of realization, right? So which is why you look at, there's a beautiful sort of illustration of the Buddhist path to meditation, right? When you're in the sky of realization, there is no distraction, there is no duality, there is no separation, there is no self, right? There is no, so the monkey mind is gone, right? So like a drop in the ocean, you disappear. Richard Lanoy again demonstrates this enhanced consciousness enables the inside and the outside. So what's happening? The inside and the outside, the subject and the object, the self and the world, do not remain separate entities, but are fused into a single process. Listen, friend, says Kabir, self turns, merges with the self, and ceases to exist. Yeah? Laldev constantly, if you look at Laldev in Ranjit Hoskote's translations of Laldev, what she says is a void mingles with a void. Because how do you describe this experience where there is no self? So a void mingles with the void. Thus, the dividing lines themselves prove to be imaginary. Two seamlessly merge into one like the water mixing with water. There is no way to tell them apart because qualitatively there's no difference. In the writings, and you see this in the writings of all mystics, right? This losing the sense of self, right? Whether it's Saint John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, Teilhard de Chardin also writes, we are one after all, you and I. Together we suffer, together we exist, and forever will recreate one another. Right? Walt Whitman, another mystic poet, he says, every atom belonging to me as good belongs to you. What is the difference? Where have our ideas of difference and separation come from? Because all of us have come from the same atoms, right? And we're breathing in the same air. And we will go back into the same earth. And out of that, new life will come. Right? So where has these ideas of differences come from? So Kabir says, when you are able to see that, we pierce through 1,000 veils of habitual, psychological, cognitive, emotional, social, linguistic, conceptual chatter that had gripped our minds for so long. Right? It's very, very difficult to do because it's all of this that you have to rend. Says Kabir, the locks of 1,000 lifetimes sprang open. Suddenly you're able to see things as they really are. You're able to see it without the obscurations. The locks of 1,000 lifetimes sprang open. Says Kabir, the storm of wisdom has hit us. Look at what he's saying. The storm of wisdom has hit us. The screens of pretense are blown away. The ropes of Maya have snapped. The ridge pole of delusion is broken. The poles of two-mindedness have collapsed. Yeah? And so, in fact, he describes it as something called Shabd ki chot. It's painful, right? It's a piercing of the arrow of insight, right? It's shocking because it's also a cognitive shock. So he describes it as Shabd ki chot, right? It wakes up the seeker from their deluded slumber. Says Kabir, everyone says I'm struck. To be struck is a terrible thing. You can truly say you're struck if you've been cut through and through, right? That's what happens. Says Laldev, when scriptures, and these are the stages, right? When the scriptures melt away, you've gone beyond the scriptures now. When the scriptures melt away, the chants remain. When the chants melt away, the mind remains. When the mind melts away, what's left? A void mingled with the void. Yeah? And Kabir also describes this. This is them trying to describe that experience. I sing without a mouth, walk without feet, fly without wings. Awareness, free of illusion, I play in the limitless. Yeah. Says Kabir, mind, where do you want to go? There is no path ahead, nor is there a traveler. There is no seeker. The seeker itself ceases to exist. There is no traveler. There is no path ahead. Says Laldev, here there is neither thou nor I, no postured thought, nothing to contemplate. Even the all-creator is forgotten. Right? And Nagarjuna, this Buddhist, so-called second Buddha, in his Mula Madhyamikarika says, every point of reference subsides. All conceptual constructs utterly subside. At no time, nowhere, and to no one did the Buddha any dharma teach. Says Laldev, my mind has become spotless. And Kabir has lost his mind. Waking up from the dream and the realization that our constructed reality has no ground is painful. It pierces the heart, right? The shabd ki chot. When we begin to see the delusion, there is a cognitive shock. And think of Hindu philosophers also describe this, right? That whole idea of the rope being mistaken for the snake, right? You're terrified, and then you see it. What happens to your fear? Or when you're dreaming, you're having a nightmare, you wake up. What happens to your fear? Right? The mind-sprung fear that the deluded experience of reality generates had no basis in reality. When our deepest delusions are burnt to dust in the fire of meditative insight, it shakes up our patterns of thought and secure habitual narratives, right? To see the cognitive illusion is to wake up from the dream, to see that we have no ground to stand on. In instituting a radical shift in perspective, both social and spiritual transformation is effective, right? But of course, you have to be ready to receive this inciting insight. You have to be ready to be struck down and burnt. Or you can choose to continue to remain in these 1,000 nets of conceptual elaborations, right? You have to make a choice. So Buddhism holds that the realization of, and when you achieve this realized state, simultaneously, so there are two wings of the bird for wisdom, for Buddhism, right? There's wisdom and compassion. The minute you reach this state, compassion automatically arises. They're the two wings of the bird. There is spontaneous care and karuna or compassion for all beings, guided by the wisdom of non-duality. An enlightened mind, free of attachment or thoughts of self-interest, experiences maitri, right? Unconditional friendliness towards all. The actions, and think of the actions that spring from such an enlightened mind, free from delusion, right? We are no longer fooled by the conceptually fictive imputed self. And the actions that such a person will perform will be positive, spontaneous, selfless, and free. And you're in that, and is described as luminous bliss, right? So, and this is the path that Buddhism offers you, that Kabir is talking about. And we have borne witness, right? We've seen what dualistic misperceptions of reality can cause, right? And why it is important for us to get out of the tangle, to cure ourselves of the divisive categories of self and other. An enlightened mind, free of attachment, will experience, maitri, right? So Hess says spiritual insight undermines the oppositional sense of self and other. No one appears your enemy, right? There is no enemy, there is no hate, there is no fear. There is only love, there is spontaneous compassion. Says Kabir, what can you know of the pain of others unless you've been struck by the word, unless you've been struck by the song? right? So when you're struck by this storm of wisdom, compassion for the pain of others will automatically arise. Wisdom evokes deep care and concern for the well-being of others. Yeah. There is a shift in world engagement, right? It's no longer about self-serving goals. There's a transformation from an attitude of reactive anger, right, which is done from a deluded kind of very limited standpoint, to one of loving, caring responsiveness. Right? You're so fully present when you're engaging in conversation and dialogue, right? You're not self-obsessed. You're not thinking about what's in it for me, right? The Buddhist practitioner can further, instead of resentment, cultivate boundless and equal compassion for all sentient beings, regardless of their past actions. Everyone, even the perceived enemy, is looked upon with compassion and understanding, right? So Goodman says, the emphasis of the no-self teaching was as much ethical as it was metaphysical. It enables acting in the world in an attitude of boundless compassion. As we untangle ourselves from the powerful grip of ego identity, we achieve greater mental freedom, and all the way till nirvana, right? Deputy writes, the maximum of mental freedom and self-regulation coincides with the absence of any self and ego. So you think of an increasing mental health issues that we are experiencing, the maximum of mental freedom and self-regulation coincides with the absence of any sense of ego or self. The Heart Sutra, and it was sometimes even known as the Heart Attack Sutra because it was so shocking, right, in what it has to say about emptiness and shunyata, but we won't go there right now, but the Heart Sutra points to such a fearless mind free of delusion. Because there are no more obstacles in my mind, they can overcome all fear, destroy all wrong perceptions, and realize perfect nirvana. In the Therigatha, we removed our defiling compulsions, we became cool and free. Right? This is how this Buddhist nun is describing it, cool and free. And in one point she says, I stretched out my legs. Right? That's how she describes that sense of I have gained enlightenment, right? Thus, having removed all delusions and mental elaborations, they arrive at the cessation of dukkha, a state of mind that is cool and free. Pelden reminds us what we call nirvana, literally, what is nirvana? Going beyond suffering, is nothing other than the exhaustion of the deluded mind's thoughts. So in the Therigatha, where Siti writes, all sorrows are cut off. This is the cessation of suffering. All sorrows are cut off, left behind. This is their end. Now I understand things. How could sorrow start again? Look at what she's saying, right? It's a cessation of suffering. Now that I understand, how could sorrow, there is no sorrow, how could sorrow start again? Thus, the fearless, blissful, awake mind stands in sharp contrast to the fearful paranoia towards the other, generated in a mind that holds on tightly to a fabricated ego identity. Just for a moment, contrast these two minds, right? Look at the deep suffering of one mind and the freedom and bliss of the other. And both are choices that you have to make. And it's not just a simple comparison, but the fact that a mind that is deluded can wreak havoc on the world and cause such deep suffering to other human beings, right? When there is violence, when there is killing, when there is bloodshed, when there is a lynching, right? Where does it come from? Rending the veil of delusion becomes a counter-hegemonic act that enables the rending of a collective delusions of self and other, calling into question our habitual world engagement, right? One is no longer tied to limiting and deluded self-serving goals. I'll wrap up just a few more points. Thus, it must be noted, and this is something that you all brought up in the Q&A as well, it must be noted that this is not a disengagement from the conventional world, but a deeper understanding of its nature and that enables its skillful navigation. One continues to engage in the tasks of one's daily life, immersed in the conventional social world, but we are able to see it for what it is. We are able to see it through the lens of ultimate truth, right? One doesn't suffer. There is no suffering. The goal of social change through the inner transformation of each individual is a slow and continual process demanding the rending of our habitual patterns and constructed ego identity. It takes time. We can't do this overnight. And what happens when we want this to happen for a nation, for a society, for a world? However, the mind needs to probe the mind's depths, to encounter its own active fabrications, to rend the veil of delusion through this mind itself. Kabir gently reminds us, slowly, slowly, O mind, everything happens slowly. The gardener pours hundreds of jars of water, but fruit only comes in season. Yeah? So we have to begin the process. We may not even, in Buddhism, of course, is this idea, it may not be that you gain nirvana in this lifetime. And in fact, in Buddhism, there's this whole idea of delaying your enlightenment so that you can help other beings, right? However, once sown, the seeds invite an expansion of thought, a broadening of our perspectives in the world beyond divisive and dualistic categories, evoking boundless love and universal compassion for all beings. No longer fooled by the fabrications nor swept up by fearful paranoia, we are thus shielded from facilitating or committing acts of socially sanctioned violence. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for such an interesting thing that you have shared with us. Let's put our hands together and thank her for this. And once again, it's time for interactive session. And I call upon Brother Joshua to moderate the session.
Philosophy also has a mystical dimension, which I think, in my personal opinion, is often overlooked in our academic endeavor. And I would like to thank Ms. Mandana for fostering us into mystical philosophy, wherein through our own poets of our own land, like Lal Ded and Kabir, to be specific. Now it's open. The floor is open for questions. Any questions? Starting with Father Henry.
I wanted to ask this question in the last session, so I will submit it to the power of the moderator anyway. So, Gayatri, thank you so much for giving us insightful presentation. So, Pandora's box is opened. So, see, some observation, then I'll ask some questions. When we discuss about emancipatory agendas or soteriology, whatever we call it, liberation, epistemology, hermeneutics, metaphysics, all these are interrelated. That means in liberation, what kind of metaphysics is involved here? What type of hermeneutics or epistemology is implied here? So, accordingly, then when we are dealing with the constructions of reality, we are asking the question, which construction is valid and how do we decide? And in these constructions, we have traditionally two approaches. One is cataphatic, another one is apophatic. A positive way and a negative way. In your presentation, you have been harping on the negative theology or negative philosophy, very much going with Buddhism. So, how do we decide this? Because hermeneutics is a very slippery ground. how do you validate a particular hermeneutics in relation to liberation? Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Hello? Yeah. So, so I'm thinking about the question. So when we use language, we're trying to sort of make sense of reality, but we are talking about now reality beyond language, right? So the whole negative approach of neti, let us say. Yeah. So, see, the way I would respond to it is finally so you said there are multiple constructions, right, of reality. Now, whose truth is more valid? Whose construction is more valid? Which do we hold on to? Which do we believe? And for you all as students, you're presented with multiple theories, multiple ideologies, multiple religions. So what do we finally adopt? And my response would be in terms of Buddhism, finally we're trying to go, or even in terms of Kabir and Lal Ded, because you can't really, even this idea of putting them under bhakti or calling them mystics are labels that we are giving them. They don't belong to any particular sect, any particular religion, or any particular tradition. They've managed to sort of transcend all of those, right? Which is why they're claimed by both Hindu and Muslim traditions, but you can't really fit them into one or the other. So finally, what Buddhism, Lal Ded, and Kabir are talking about are somehow going beyond constructs altogether, right? So hermeneutics and this whole act of meaning making is useful and helps us to engage in our reality. But sometimes, but what they're talking about again is going beyond any construction, going beyond language itself, right? Because in some way, the minute you're dealing with constructions and meaning and language, it's always very, very limiting, right? The limits of your language are the limits of your world in terms of, it's a larger discussion, but what Wittgenstein was trying to say as well. So, so the minute you're trying to hold on to a particular ideology, a particular construct, a particular narrative, it sometimes in a way limits you, right? What they're trying to say is go beyond all of these, right? So you can use it up to a point, but at a certain point you have to let it go. Because while Kabir and Lal Ded may have begun their spiritual journey, and for y'all also that might be the case, y'all begin your spiritual journey in a particular tradition, in the process of making that journey to the interior, what is it that you encounter, what is it that you discover, and sometimes you go beyond your tradition, you go beyond your religion, you have a mystical experience, you have an experience of non-duality, right, an experience of shunyata. Right? And this is beyond any kind of categorization or labels. Yeah, so yeah, I would say that it's not really a question of one construction of reality versus the other, but to go beyond all constructions, and which is why you're going beyond language itself, right? The minute all of these constructions, all of this hermeneutics, all of this meaning making, right, is in language, right? But can we go to a place? And which is why I'm saying that all, whether it's a Lal Ded or a Kabir or a Buddha, I'm saying they're all drinking from the same well because they have arrived at that place. That space of limitless freedom, that space of blissful luminosity, right? That space of non-conceptual thought, where in that Buddhist kind of illustration of their meditation, you're now flying in the sky, right? There is no self merges with the self no longer exists. Right? There is no mind. Yeah, because the minute, and which is why Nagarjuna says that Shunyata is also, so Nagarjuna is a great kind of Buddhist scholar who constantly comes back to this idea of Shunyata or emptiness. But the minute then we, using our conceptual minds, then want to hold on to this concept of Shunyata, he tells you Shunyata is also Shunya, right? So that Shunyata is also empty. So he gives, there's nothing, our mind constantly wants constructs or labels or categories to hold on to. But the idea, what they are trying to say is finally you have to let go of all of that, right? You have to go beyond these kinds of labels and categorization and constructions and hermeneutical endeavors. Yeah, thank you.
Good afternoon, ma'am. This is Pawan. My question remained from the first session and connected to the present session. And I was touched with the phrase that you have told. We act in the world, how we act in our world. And when we deal about this phrase, the self is very significant. And looking at the self in today's perspective, the Gen Z, or today what we call it Zen Gamma, it's completely dominant. So self is not with us, but then predominantly taken over by the society or the AI. And again, here comes the Buddhist philosophy or the mystic poetry, which says there is no self. And what do you say on this?
Yeah, and that can be a terrifying thought. And that's why I said in our contemporary world, there is always, whether it's modern society, whether it's Instagram, whether it's social media, this whole sense of constantly putting the self front and center, right? I navigate the world knowing who I am, right? I have to be assertive. I am in this whole idea of individuality. So, and increasingly we're seeing how that is related to increasing mental health issues as well, right? This kind of where you become so self-absorbed, you become so self-obsessed, and your whole world and your worldview is very limiting, right? And very limited. And you are in deep suffering, and you cause deep suffering to other people, yeah? So, and it becomes, which is why it's a huge challenge, not just for us, but especially for students today, right? How do they can't even imagine, right? They can't even conceptualize. They can't even imagine a space in which there is no self, because we're like, without the self, how do I navigate the world? Who am I? I won't know. If I don't know who I am, I don't know who you are. How do we interact? How do we engage, right? So we are perpetually kind of constructing the self and the other so that we can navigate the world, and navigate the world in a way where you put yourself out there, right? It's your CV, it's your job, it's an extremely kind of competitive space that you're dealing with. You have to deal, hell is other people, right? So that sense of where you put yourself as self front and center, it's something, even for us, I mean, can you imagine what Buddhism is saying by this concept of anatta, right? Or no self. It's difficult for us to imagine, or even this other idea of no thought. Have you had an experience of no thought? And my students struggle. Some of my students say that it's not even possible. But it's not compulsory to think. Why do we spend so much of our time, sometimes with very unproductive thoughts, sometimes thoughts that cause ourselves deep suffering, and because it's so habitual, we're just stuck in that loop of suffering. We can't let go of our past, of things that haunt us, right? So we think that it's not even possible to, so what Buddhism is saying in terms of no thought, is that even possible? The idea of no self, is that even possible? Yeah. So that's something that we struggle to even imagine and think of. But why Buddhism is saying to think about it is, in fact, it opens you to boundless possibilities and freedoms, right? You're no longer limited. And like I said, it frees you up to love, right? You're able to see the other through the lens of love and empathy, right? Rather than, if you're just going to be clouded by the self all the time, you won't even see the person sitting next to you, right? How are you going to be able to care about the suffering of the world? How are you going to care about human rights issues? How are you going to care about injustice if you're just thinking about yourself? But I agree, and especially in today's world, it's extremely difficult to do. Yeah.
So, good afternoon. Actually, we are talking about resistance and freedom. In the first conversation, there was a comment like a crime of resistance. But I think from the evidential proofs that we have, here in the world, the resistances help us to flourish the abundance of freedom sometimes. For example, when you keep water in a dam, it is resisted to provide abundance of water to produce better products also. And silence helps us to bring up the abundance of ideas, the different constructs and structures that our forefathers, example JD also, made for us, make us to come together and think of better insights in the present context. So, in order to flourish the freedom in the present context of our Indian context, what could be the better constructs in a religion like Christianity to come up with the more free thoughts? And what could be the better constructs in our institute like JD to come up with better free thoughts? Thank you.
All right. So I think one thing that all of you all are taught also is how to be critical thinkers, right? How to question, how to engage with what is happening in India and the world today, right? And so that sense of being able to ask questions, being able to think about it, right? Because even for Kabir and Lal Ded, it wasn't easy in their times. They were called heretical. They were called mad. They were challenging the status quo, right? The minute they're against kind of caste hierarchies, ritual worship, animal sacrifice. What is the use of doing all of these things? And they're extremely critical and harsh about it. Even and it was a huge risk for them in their times as well, right? So in that sense, while they're talking again about these ideas of enlightenment and mysticism, they're also talking about engaging with the social realities of their time. Yeah. So and I would suggest, I mean, one thing that I think becomes very, very important, whether it's JD, whether it's our country, is it possible for us to have dialogue, right? Are we comfortable with having dialogues with people whose views are very different from our own? Are we able to step into their shoes? Are we able to see the world from their perspective? Are we comfortable with that? Because sometimes we like to be in our own silos. We like to be in our own bubbles. We like to only talk with like-minded people, right? And there used to be a time where on Facebook, anyone whose political opinion was different from your own, you would just unfriend them. I know of friends of people who don't, family members, right, who don't talk to each other, haven't talked to each other for the last decade, for instance, right? There's a certain sense of, I feel that as a nation, and perhaps even in our families and even in our relationships, there's a certain sense where there is a breakdown of dialogue, where we feel that there's no point. Like we are so different, we are so wholly different, that it's no point talking to the other. It's no, we put ourselves on this great pedestal, right? We only engage with, we want to be in our safe spaces and only engage with certain kinds of people. Everyone is saying the same things. We're all very comfortable, right? We don't want our values to be challenged. We don't want our ideas, our religion, our beliefs to be challenged, right? And I think we need more of that, right? So even if someone, and sometimes, you know, we are so quick to offense, so free to sort of take offense, and this whole idea of cancel culture and all of that, right? So everyone has to be very careful about what they're saying, right? We always have to be politically correct. And sometimes but we're not dialoguing, because sometimes when someone says something, it is said because they want to offend. But sometimes it comes from a space of ignorance. And at that point, can we be curious? Can we ask a follow-up question? Or do we just get angry and mad at that other person, right? And sometimes in the process of dialogue with someone whose views are very extreme and very different from your own, you will also realize that perhaps there are certain things that we share in common, and perhaps that we share more things in common that then divide us. And that is a scary thought, right? Because we want to think of ourselves as very different from this other person, right? And which is why we make a caricature of the other person. And we label them and we limit them, and that is who they are. And they are perhaps doing the same to us. And then if citizens of a country can't dialogue and talk to each other, if people in families can't dialogue and talk to each other, we're just going to be increasingly more polarized, more divided, and it'll lead to chaos, right? We can go into a very, very dark place. So as a suggestion, dialogue for me would be something that and dialogue with the other, dialogue with different. We're supposed to be all open to different points of views and different opinions and people very different from us. But what do we really think about people who are different from us? Are we ready to engage in dialogue? Yeah. Thank you.
Actually, that could be better solution for conscience level freedom. What about the matter level freedom? Thank you.
Okay, I think just rephrase your question.
See, you said as a solution dialogue, that could be better for the conscience. You said no, we are a build-up of conscience and matter.
Yeah.
So conscience level freedom could be enhanced by the dialogues. But still, there are matter level freedom.
Yeah. I understand.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So of course, right? So one is when you're trying to bring about social change. One way to do it is to bring about change in the mind, right? How you construct your realities, and through dialogue we can effect change, right? That is the hope. And the other level is finally hands-on, right? You have to step into the world. You have to change policy. You have to speak with people who are in decision-making positions, right? We have to go. I'm not saying that you have to make your voice heard, right? And how you make your voice heard and what you do becomes very, very important, and especially for so many of you all who work with other communities, right? You work with people who are very different from you. You work sometimes with people who are in deep suffering, right? So that work is also extremely important, yeah. So, and which is why like I said, when it comes to Lal Ded and Kabir, they were challenging the status quo of their time, right? So they were very much against kind of Brahminical hierarchies and authorities and ritual worship, right? And you have to pay. And the other thing for all of you to keep in mind is when you make those decisions, sometimes there is a price to pay, right? And Lal Ded and Kabir also had to pay that price, yeah. So you can decide, when engaging with the challenges of your time, how you want to do it and what choices and decisions you will make.
Thank you, Gayatri. I was hoping some more students may ask some questions, but anyway, I will continue with my question, and I think some students will also interact. I would like to continue with what Henry raised, the constructions of a twofold type, the cataphatic and the apophatic. But both these constructions, though sometimes people associate the apophatic with the mystics, I think that is also essentialist. Both are equally essentialist. And anything that is essentialist will go by a binary language. And the moment you have a binary language, then always we are caught up in the same circle of the I, and then the other, and the you, and all this kind of trouble is there. Now in Greek, they use the word pharmakon to indicate both the remedy and the poison. It is, at the same time it is poison, but also it is a remedy. Language is something like that. The language we use is really poisonous. It is very divisive. It's all the time, it is all that. We go by oppositions all the time, the language we use. But I think we have to also use the same language to experience this, finally, the what you are saying about the anatta, the no-self experience, or the bliss, profound bliss. We also need the same language. So it has to be used as the remedy. So it is, maybe philosophy should be therefore become more and more poetical. Since you're also a literature person, you may be able to say that. That could be the reason why mystics are making use of poetry. Philosophers are not, but then the mystics. Perhaps it's the language of the mad people, like Nietzsche, for example. He can never write anything logically. And that's exactly, he was a madman. And there are powerful insights there. So I think we need to probably use in philosophy a madman's language. And as part of that madman's vocabulary, probably dialogue may not be a very good word, because it is two ways of reasoning. Maybe we should invent diaphilos, two ways of loving. Thank you. Maybe you can have your comment on that.
Yeah. Thanks so much for those lovely insights. Right? So think about, and that is the human mind, right? This whole idea of binaries, which is why Rumi, in fact, has this poem where he says, beyond right and wrong, there is a field. Meet me there, right? But because we're continuously kind of trapped by language, like Father Nishant said, and by the binary mind. We want everything to be black and white, right and wrong. And is life like that? Right? Even when it's self and other, all of these binaries, all of these oppositions, or even trying to understand the nature of reality, right? If you're going to look at it in binaries, you'll never really have the full picture. Yeah, and you can't disconnect because the world doesn't operate like that, right? In terms of these kinds of disconnections, but yeah, in terms of bringing in love and so again, the minute. So I would say that when you're entering into dialogue as well, if it is done in an attitude of love, of openness, of curiosity, of understanding, right? Even if it is opposing kinds of points of view, in that, if it is done in that attitude, in that process, both parties are changed, right? Both have deeper understanding and perhaps even deeper empathy, right? Because in the process of dialogue, if I'm truly open and I want to hear what the other person has to say, and it comes from an attitude of love, right? Then there is understanding, then there is growth, then there is empathy, right? And then there is healing, perhaps, even for greatly polarized and divided people. Yeah. But and to respond very quickly about language, it's exactly, and that is the whole challenge. For Kabir as a poet, finally he has to use language, and he's aware of the limitations of language, which is why he comes up with something called an ulat bamsi, right? An upside down language. He's very aware, because he says, I will be trapped like a parrot on a pole, right? He's very aware of the traps of language and the challenges of using language to point to something that is beyond it.
Father Dinesh?
Yeah, let me see if I can put my thoughts into words. First of all, I want to thank you for the invitation to move out from being armchair philosophers into action. I think it's a danger, and we can get caught up in this world of playing around with words and ideas. So a little bit of coming down to earth. Some of the research that I've been engaged in, working with people and helping them to come to touch very profound experiences. And we noticed that after that, there was a much greater sense of connection to others, a much greater sense of what we call universality, and a sense of respecting others, which is, I think, something that you were talking about. The question, therefore, for all of us here, not just for you, is will we get into action? The action that kind of starts with exploring the self, the action that starts moving beyond our own identities, which are mutually exclusive, towards ever-growing identities that are more and more inclusive, until finally there is this all-inclusive shunyata. I think that's the invitation that I would like to present, not just to you, but for all of us, including myself.
Thank you. And yes, there's a lot of research actually that's being done about how greater understanding of a concept like shunyata translates directly into kind of this, there's a certain openness, there's a certain freedom, there's research that backs all of this. So whatever we've discussed, there's a lot of research that is being done, that has been done to show the tangible change, right, of opening up the mind, of opening up your own possibilities, of freedom, and what that does to human relationships. Yeah, so it leads to, it definitely leads to real world action as well. And like Father Dinesh was saying, it starts with you making a choice, right? You making a choice to begin that particular journey. And it's tough work, right? It's wrestling with the darkness within, like Laldev was saying. So, and yeah, so it begins with action. So action doesn't necessarily have to be out there in the world. Sometimes action begins first with that journey to the interior, that introspection and reflection, and automatically that will translate into real world action, right? So when it comes to automatically with wisdom, compassion arises, right? That enlarged mentality that Father was talking about in terms of how your horizons and your boundaries of who you are change, right?
Ramiro.
When we talk about in Buddhism about self-liberation, and when you beautifully talk about self and non-self, in all this process, is helping others doesn't come as a part of liberation? And if that is the case, how does it work? How does Buddhism look at that? And how, as a normal human beings, we understand helping others as part of our own liberation?
Yeah, so in fact for the Buddhist, they're deeply, especially when you talk about the Bodhisattva figure, they're deeply, deeply compassionate, right? To the extent where, and there are all of these examples where a Bodhisattva realized that, you know, a tigress was hungry and she had to feed her cubs, he gives up his body, right? Or there's a certain sense where there are maggots in the flesh, right? And when the Bodhisattva doesn't want to injure hurt the maggots or the person, so he removes those maggots literally with his tongue, right? To do it as gently as possible. So there's a certain sense of extreme, and these are very extreme examples, right? Of where Bodhisattvas, where they place the other so much before themselves, right? So there's deep compassion, there's deep empathy, which is why Kabir and Lal Ded, there's a sense of crying, there's a sense of lamenting, right, for the suffering of the other. So of course, helping the other becomes very, very important, but one of the ways to help the other is to bring about the cessation of suffering, right? The mental suffering, right? Because if you understand that, you don't suffer, right? So which is why talking about these concepts become very important for the Buddhist, again, because then you're able to alleviate the suffering of the other. Because through when they understand the nature of mind and reality, their suffering is reduced. Because the Buddhist is completely dedicated. In fact, all the Buddhist prayers is complete dedication to reducing the suffering of the world, reducing to the suffering of the other, praying for a world in which there is only well-being and there is no suffering, right? So very much, there are and lots of stories, lots of examples of extreme sort of giving oneself over to the other, right? To alleviate the suffering of the other. Yeah, so both the mental suffering and the physical suffering, both are important to the Buddhist. Yeah.
Good afternoon, ma'am. This is Edwin. First of all, I would like to thank you. Your presentation was off the chart. My question, the question I'm going to ask you is related to previous presentation. You said we are causing our own suffering, and you quoted one poem also, a line from the poem. We are caught up in a snare in upside down. When we look at it at the personal level, it is, I understand. But when we look at the world at large, how do you respond? Like when we see what is happening in Gaza and Ukraine, can you respond? Please respond to it.
Yeah. So and realize that there's armed conflict that's not just happening in one part of the world. There is currently ongoing conflict in different regions of the world, right? So in terms of to understand the depth of suffering, the scale of human loss, the kind of ongoing over a long period of time, right? And this is something, and this is what's happening in the world today. We have seen it happening in the world in the past, right? And that's something that we all need to ask, right? What is our response in the face of human suffering, right? Because, and of course, when we talk about in certain places, there is the scale is so much larger, right? And what happens when there's silence? What is our response? How do we engage? How do we engage with it, right? How do we make sense of it? And of course, there are different ways in which one can do this. My response first is sometimes it's so easy to hate and to despair, right? And to lose all hope, yeah? Especially given the numbers that we're seeing, the scale of the suffering that we're seeing. But what becomes important right now is to try and also understand, right? So, and which is why Matthew Ricard said that the point is neither to condemn, right, or to hate, but to try and understand the root of the problem. And which is why studying Buddhism and whichever religious tradition that you come from, to try and use those insights, those wisdom, to try and make sense of these realities, right? To try and understand why they're happening. What you choose to do, of course, is personal. I can't tell you what your response should be. My only response is that one shouldn't despair, but to try to understand, right? And that understanding then guards us against ever participating in something like that, right? Because you are a critical thinker, you're not swept up by, you're not blindly sort of following a particular ideology, right? So the only thing that you can do right now is to guard yourself from committing acts of socially sanctioned violence. Yeah, so, and to not despair in the face of it, but to try to understand it. Yeah. Yes.
So my question is, first of all, I appreciate the talk, and I feel it was a very intellectual as well as spiritual talk. And so the question is, like this, your talk appeals to all of us, the idea of getting involved in oneself, trying to understand oneself, and then trying to find solution to the suffering. However, my question is this approach pragmatic? Like for instance, in Marathi Bhakti movement, we have Sant Tukaram, who was all the time involved in this Bhakti, all the time taking the name of God. And then he was too much involved that he neglected his family life. And even today, people question the contribution of Mahatma Gandhi's non-violence in the freedom struggle. This is not my personal opinion, but however, people question this. So my question is, isn't it more appropriate to limit this kind of spiritual approach to one's own personal self and to have a more pragmatic or even Machiavellian approach in the political or civil affairs? To have a more kind of practical approach to reduce the suffering of the world.
Yeah, so in terms of, so to understand what Buddhism's approach is pragmatic, it is practical, it is optimistic, right? But I understand what you're saying, that sometimes it seems that we are in our ivory towers and we're not engaged in the social realities of our time, or in the examples that you gave, that sometimes what happens that when we're caught up in this kind of mysticism, that we are perhaps not, we let go of other responsibilities that we have taken up, right? So, yeah. I'm just thinking in terms of how to respond to you. Yeah, so again, that's not, see, I understand in the examples that you gave, and even, but finally Buddhism is not saying, or Kabir is not saying, that we have to be engaged from the social realities, right? So it's very much about, it's meant to go hand in hand. Again, we're trying to think of it in binaries. We're trying to separate it by saying that, that mysticism is separate and social realities are separate, right? But the two should ideally go hand in hand, right? So one should, and like Father Dinesh said, right? The minute you engage in these ideas and you make these journeys to the interior of who you are, it in fact helps you to be a better human being in society, in the social realities of your time, right? And yeah, and when you so when you talk about politics and all of that, if that's a game you want to play, then that's a different kind of ball game, right? Where you're trying to then then it comes questions of identity, questions of power, questions of ideologies, all of that is a very different kind of world, right? And I won't go into it, but I'll just place it as a thought. We also have this whole idea of a philosopher king, right? Is it possible to have a philosopher king, right? And what does that mean? Can it, and you have a figure like Ashoka, for instance, right? So, and that's a longer conversation, but what I'm trying to say is, can these two ideas come together? Do they necessarily have to be kind of separated, or can we look at them as, in a way, interrelated? Yeah, yes.
Probably, to continue with that, the question that you asked, since you will be preparing for a comprehensive, this may be good. See, you seem to be presuming there is a two different realm. One is spiritual, which is personal. Another thing is political, that is social. The question presupposes that. Once Gandhi was asked, what kind of marga do you follow? Gandhi said, I am a karma yogi. If you are a karma yogi, why the hell are you spending so much time in meditation, prayer in the morning? He said, precisely because I am a karma yogi, I need inner strength to do that. So you see the point of this kind of a positioning, spiritual is something different from social or political. That's a very, very narrow framework within which we operate. So we should be able to see, if you are deeply spiritual, you cannot be but politically engaged. And if you are politically engaged, you need some kind of strength which comes from this spiritual. And Buddhism, I think, is trying to, I wouldn't say they were politically engaged, but then they had a vision of a life which is politically enabling. So I think also Kabir, the resistance, all these things come from this inner freedom of the spiritual dynamics that is at work. So from the point of view of comprehensive, try and connect these things. Thank you.
Due to the amount of time, we'll just have one more intervention. Yes, sister.
And just to respond to that, try and just Google and read up a little bit more about socially engaged Buddhism, right? So you see the two coming together there.
Thank you, madam, for your inspirational talk. And you have brought out many beautiful concepts like meditation, reflection, and constructed knowledge and all these things. You spoke about we live in a world that which is awarded, like we construct our own identity, and for the enlightenment, we need to let go ourselves and this constructed self. And you use the term to let go the conventional self. My question is, in this contemporary world where there is a lot of noise around and chaos, and there is no time for anyone, and there is also fear if we speak about a word silent or to reflect or to sit. In this scenario, how would you explain to let go, firstly, the conventional self, and how is it easy for the people to, or how is it relevant, the Buddhist teachings in this?
Yeah. So Buddhism, of course, does outline a path in terms of you, and you have different, to realize also that there are different Buddhist traditions, it's an ocean, there are different ways in which, and sometimes they disagree and debate with each other as well. But all of them, of course, talk about the cessation of suffering, right? So, so how does one do it? So there are different paths that are outlined, right? And if it's meditation, then you have something called insight meditation, and you have something called shamatha meditation, right? So I mean, so it's a longer conversation, but there are different paths in which, and the different meditative practices that one can adopt to try and understand the nature of mind and the nature of reality. But very true, in today's world when there is so much conceptual chatter, there is so much noise, there is so much this entire constructing of the self, how does one find the time, the energy, the inclination, right? And perhaps it has to come, and no one else can do it for you, right? So there has to be some inciting insight, some thought, some experience, right? That goads you on that particular path, that begins where you start questioning the nature of your own existence, the nature of your own reality, right? And in that process, you deal with uncomfortable questions, right? And to make sense of that, you go to a particular, whichever religious tradition it is, right? To make sense of that, and all religious traditions have this kind of this either silent meditation or contemplative practices through which you can engage with these realities and these challenges, right? So I'm not saying again that Buddhism is the only path that you have to follow, but to realize that there are multiple paths, and to realize, which is why for someone. And each of us are very different as human beings. So what might work for me may not work for someone else, right? Which is why you have the Jnana Marg, the Karma Marg, the Bhakti Marg, right? So it depends on what kind of person you are and how, and what path then would work best for you. Which is why in Buddhism, again, who becomes very important is the guru. So finding a good guru becomes very important, because the guru might say one thing to one disciple, and might say something completely different to another disciple, right? Because the guru understands you and what is required for you on your spiritual path, right? So it's not one size fits all, it's not one answer for everybody. It depends on each person, right? And the guru would be able to guide you on that particular path. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you everyone for your questions, and we would like to thank you, Ms. Mandana, for all your efforts and patiently answering all our questions. I hope someday we will also be able to find the well and drink from it, the well that Buddha, Laldev and Kabir found. Thank you so much, and can we all put our hands together for Ms. Manda?
Friend beside me says that this auditorium is filled with ideas of philosophy rather with oxygen and carbon dioxide. It's only because of the interaction between ma'am and you. So let us thank her and with a big round of applause. Life remains incomplete if we are not grateful to what we receive every day and every time in life. So now I take this space to propose the vote of thanks. And I take this delight moment to thank Professor Gayatri for her availability, enthusiastic interaction and argumentation, which left a deep and ceaseless reflection on mind, self, and freedom in reality. So let's put our hands together and thank her. We also thank Professor Nishant, all the professors gathered here and the faculty for their concrete support and encouragement. They remain unseen as the root of the plant and elevators as the fruit of the tree, which help us to grow. So let's put our hands together for their encouragement. We also thank the student council and all the other students who worked behind the screen. Let's put our hands together for the unseen work they did and for the successful day. Let's thank them. And also it's my delight in expressing my gratitude to the students from Symbiosis School for Liberal Arts. Their presence here shows their respect and love towards us. So let's give them a lovely clap. And my dear friends, I feel privileged to thank you all for your active participation in asking questions and expressing your views and clarifying the doubts. It's really fruitful, and I believe. So let's thank one another by clapping. So let us remain always grateful to the life for the opportunities that we are getting. And thank you, everyone, and have a fruitful day ahead. Let's meet on Monday.